It was a Friday night at Joe's Diner, the kind of place where the locals came for comfort food and quiet conversation. The clink of silverware and soft hum of chatter filled the air, setting a peaceful atmosphere. But all of that changed when the doors swung open, and in strode a group of bikers. With their leather jackets, rough faces, and booming laughter, they cut through the calm like a knife. Their presence was immediately felt, and every head in the diner turned, the air thickening with tension. One of them, Tony, a tall, burly man with a chipped tooth and a cocky grin, looked around the room like he owned it. Rachel sat in her usual booth, tucked in the corner near the window. She wasn't expecting much excitement tonight. In fact, she hadn't expected much from life lately. After a rough year, losing her father, the collapse of her marriage, and the struggles of running a small business, she'd promised herself a peaceful night out. A simple dinner at her favorite diner. Just her and a book. Nothing more. But fate had other plans. As the bikers settled at a table nearby, their loud voices cut through her thoughts. Tony's booming laugh echoed across the room, followed by a string of crude jokes. Rachel stiffened, feeling her stomach churn. This was exactly the kind of night she didn't want. She went back to her menu, trying to ignore the scene unfolding just a few feet away. But as Tony's voice rose louder, his words directed towards her caught her attention. "What's a pretty lady like you doing all alone? Shouldn't you be out with someone who knows how to have fun?" He smirked, leaning in her direction. Rachel's pulse quickened. She didn't need to turn around to know who he was talking to. The way the other bikers chuckled made her skin crawl. Why me? She thought, but it wasn't the first time she'd been targeted. Still, something inside her stirred, an unspoken frustration building up, waiting to break free. What would she do? How far would she let them push before speaking up? The waitress walked by, offering Rachel a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry about them. They've been here a lot lately." Rachel didn't answer, her thoughts racing. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation, but the bikers weren't going to let her be left in peace. It was clear now that they'd picked the wrong person to mess with. What would you do in Rachel's situation? Would you stand up for yourself, or would you try to ignore it? Let me know in the comments. Rachel had always been a fighter, even when she didn't know it. Growing up in a small town, she learned early on that life wasn't going to hand her anything on a silver platter. Her father, a mechanic with calloused hands and a hard heart, was a man of few words. He worked long hours, taught her the value of hard work, and instilled in her a sense of resilience that would carry her through life's toughest moments. Her mother, on the other hand, was gentle and loving, but always overshadowed by her father's dominant presence. As a child, Rachel spent much of her time in the garage, watching her father fix cars. He wasn't affectionate in the way other dads were, but his quiet support meant everything to her. She learned how to troubleshoot a car engine before she could even drive, and his unspoken approval was more fulfilling than any words he could say. But when Rachel was in her teens, things began to change. Her father's health started to decline. It was subtle at first, occasional coughs, long days of tiredness, but over time, the slow fade became undeniable. Her mother's once subdued presence grew stronger, and Rachel, now a young adult, found herself caught in the struggle to hold her family together. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, her father passed away. It was the hardest moment of Rachel's life. She felt like a ship lost at sea, without her anchor. The grief hit her in waves, and though she continued to push forward, she couldn't shake the emptiness that settled in her chest. In the years that followed, Rachel tried to find her footing. She moved to the city, opened a boutique, and built a life for herself. But the pain of losing her father never fully faded. The death of her marriage didn't help. Her ex-husband, once her high school sweetheart, had simply walked away, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. At first, she had blamed him, but over time, she came to realize that the real cause of the breakup had been a growing distance between them, something neither of them could fix. The separation had been mutual, but that didn't make it any easier. Her boutique became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the task of curating the perfect collection of clothing. She was proud of it, but every quiet evening alone in her apartment made her feel more disconnected from the world around her. That's when she started coming to Joe's Diner, a place to breathe, A place to be alone, yet feel connected to something bigger than herself. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Tonight, as Rachel sat in her usual booth, she hoped for the same peace she had found here in the past. But as the biker's laughter reached her ears, she couldn't help but feel the stirrings of a past she had long since tried to bury. For all her strength, for all her independence, she was still that girl who had learned to survive in the shadow of her father's death, and it seemed like tonight, that girl was waking up again. Have you ever felt like you were carrying the weight of the past with you? How did you cope with it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rachel's grip tightened on her fork, her knuckles turning white. The loud laughter of the bikers echoed around the small diner, and she could feel her patience starting to crack. It wasn't that she couldn't handle noise. She had lived in crowded apartments as a child, and the constant buzz of the city was something she had learned to tune out. But this was different. This was a deliberate disruption. They weren't just loud, they were intrusive, aggressive even. Her eyes flicked over to the group of bikers, where Tony sat with his feet up on the chair, swaggering with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She wasn't sure why, but something about his demeanor irked her deeply. It wasn't just the casual disrespect, it was the way he looked at people like they were beneath him. For a moment, Rachel's mind wandered back to her ex-husband, Alex. He used to look at her like that sometimes, as if she was just a quiet, agreeable thing to be tolerated. He never raised his voice like Tony, but the dismissiveness was the same, and that had been enough to unravel everything between them. She had spent years trying to fit into a mold that didn't suit her, hoping to make him happy. But after the divorce, she realized she had been the one who had to learn to stand up for herself, not just for others, but for her own peace of mind. This was no different. These bikers might not know it yet, but they had just pushed her to a breaking point. Rachel took a deep breath and looked back down at her plate. Stay calm, she told herself. Stay composed. But the bikers weren't making it easy. Tony's voice rose again, louder this time. What's wrong, sweetheart? Cat got your tongue? You look like you could use some company, he jeered, his eyes locking with hers across the room. Rachel felt a hot flush rise to her cheeks. Her heart began to race, but she didn't let the fear show. This wasn't about her. This was about making sure they knew that just because they walked into the diner like they owned it didn't mean they could ruin it for everyone else. But could she stand up to them? Her fingers drummed nervously on the table. She had been through enough pain to know that sometimes, keeping your head down and walking away was the easiest choice, the safest choice. But that wasn't the choice she had made after her father died. That wasn't the choice she had made when Alex walked away. She had fought back before, and she wasn't about to let these strangers treat her like she was weak. But there was always that voice in her head, the one that asked, what if they push back? What if it escalates? She stole another glance at Tony, who was now laughing with his friends, oblivious to the storm brewing in Rachel's mind. Her pulse quickened as she imagined what it would feel like to stand up for herself, not just for tonight, but for every moment in her life where she had let things slide to avoid conflict. Maybe tonight, I'll finally draw a line, she thought. Just as she was about to stand up, the waitress approached her table, carrying a fresh glass of water. I'm sorry about them, the waitress said quietly, offering Rachel a sympathetic smile. They've been like that every time they come in. It's hard to get them to tone down. Rachel nodded, but she could feel a tight knot form in her stomach. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wanted respect. She had to decide whether she was going to continue sitting silently or confront the situation head-on. A part of her wanted to leave, to walk out of the diner and pretend it hadn't happened. But another part, an older, stronger part of her, knew she couldn't let these guys win. Not tonight. She stood up, the scrape of her chair against the floor sounding louder than it should have. She walked toward the counter, where Tony was now leaning back, talking with his friends. He glanced up as she approached, his grin widening. Looks like the quiet little lady wants a word, he said, the taunting edge to his voice unmistakable. The other bikers snickered. Rachel swallowed her frustration. I'd appreciate it if you kept it down, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm trying to enjoy my meal, and you're making it impossible. The bikers fell silent for a moment, and Rachel could feel the heat of their stares. Tony's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. leaning forward as if challenging her. You think I'm the problem here, sweetheart? It's just a little fun. Maybe you need to lighten up, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Rachel felt her heart pound in her chest. Stay calm, she reminded herself. She wasn't going to let him turn this into a joke. This wasn't about her being too serious. It was about respect. I'm not asking for much, she said, her voice steady. Just a little consideration. Tony stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. For a second, it felt like the room held its breath. And then, with a shrug, he turned back to his friends and waved it off. Whatever you say, lady, he said, and the conversation shifted back to the group, as though she was nothing more than a minor distraction. Rachel exhaled, the tension easing from her shoulders. She had done it. She had stood her ground. The bikers didn't apologize, but at least they knew she wasn't someone to be ignored. As she turned to sit back down, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a situation like Rachel's? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. Rachel sank back into her booth, the adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. Her heart was racing, and her hands were slightly trembling, but she was proud of herself. She had said her piece. She had made her point. She wasn't going to let some rude bikers ruin her night, or her peace of mind. The din of the diner gradually returned to normal, but the biker's presence still loomed large in the corner of her eye. Tony, the one who had mocked her earlier, was still holding court with his friends, laughing and making crude jokes. His comment about her being a quiet little lady had stung, but she wouldn't let him see that. She wasn't about to let him or anyone else make her feel small. But as much as she tried to ignore them, something felt off. Tony's eyes kept flicking over to her table. Every time their gazes met, his smile turned into a smirk, a kind of challenge. Rachel took a deep breath and tried to focus on her meal. The warm soup in front of her was comforting, but it did little to calm her nerves. Her mind kept racing, thinking about the words she had said. She had stood her ground, but was that enough? Would they let it go? Or would things escalate? Just as she was starting to lose herself in her thoughts, the door to the diner swung open again, letting in a gust of cold air. Another biker entered, this one different from the others. He wasn't as loud, didn't boast about his exploits, but he still carried himself with the same air of dominance. He had a few tattoos peeking from under his leather jacket, and his eyes were sharp, calculating. He walked directly over to Tony's table, ignoring the rest of the diners, and leaned down to exchange a few words with him. Tony looked up, his smirk fading into a more serious expression. Rachel couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way they spoke in hushed tones made her uneasy. Her pulse quickened, and she found herself glancing at them more frequently. They hadn't been much of a problem before, but now she was starting to feel like the focus had shifted. Was she a target now? Did she just make herself an enemy in this group? She didn't know, but the thought weighed heavily on her chest. Minutes later, the new biker, who Rachel hadn't seen before, turned and walked straight toward her booth. Her stomach dropped. Here it comes. He stopped at her table and leaned in slightly, not in a threatening way, but with a quiet intensity that immediately sent her on high alert. Mind if I sit? He asked in a low voice. Rachel's eyes narrowed. She wasn't sure what game he was playing, but she knew better than to trust someone like him, especially after what had just happened. No, I do mind, she said, her voice firm but polite. If you're looking for a fight, I suggest you look somewhere else. The biker's lips twitched, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't mocking or cruel, just a knowing kind of smile, like he'd expected this response. I'm not here for a fight, he said, sitting down across from her without waiting for an invitation. I just wanted to talk. Name's Jack. Rachel raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond immediately. She wasn't going to play along. She wasn't in the mood for games, especially after everything that had already gone down. Why? She asked, her tone cold. Why talk now? Jack's eyes softened, as though he could sense her suspicion, but he didn't back off. I know Tony can be a bit much sometimes. He likes to push people, see what they're made of. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. Rachel studied him carefully. His posture was relaxed, his voice calm, but she didn't trust him. Not yet. Not after what she had just dealt with. I'm fine, she replied curtly. Thanks for the concern. Jack gave a slight nod but didn't move. He sat there for a moment, just observing her, as if he was trying to understand something deeper. Rachel could feel the weight of his gaze, but she refused to look away. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. He finally spoke again, breaking the silence. You know, you've got guts. A lot of people wouldn't stand up to Tony like that. Most would have just let him keep talking. Rachel blinked, surprised by the compliment. She had expected mockery, not praise. But she wasn't about to let her guard down just yet. I don't do well with bullies, she replied, her voice steady. Jack leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. I get it. Trust me, I do. That's kind of why I wanted to talk. You're not like the others. You don't back down. Rachel's suspicion deepened. She wasn't sure whether Jack was genuinely trying to make peace, or if he was simply playing a game. But something told her that this wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this. He seemed too calm, too collected. You're right, she said, her voice sharp. I don't back down. For a moment, there was a long silence between them. The other bikers had returned to their conversation, but Rachel could still feel the tension hanging in the air. She wasn't sure what Jack wanted from her, but she wasn't going to let her guard down. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping slightly against the floor. Well, I just wanted to make sure you were all right. I'll leave you to your dinner. As he walked away, Rachel felt the tension in her body release slightly, but the unease still lingered. Tony might have backed off for now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The bikers hadn't just messed with the wrong woman tonight. They had awakened something in her, a strength she hadn't realized was still there, and she wasn't about to let them, or anyone else, push her around anymore. How would you feel if someone like Jack approached you after a confrontation? Would you trust them, or stay cautious? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rachel sat back in her booth, her mind spinning with the unexpected interaction with Jack. Everything in her told her not to trust him. He was part of the group, after all. He might have been trying to show a softer side, but she wasn't buying it. Not yet. The bikers had already shown their true colors, and one kind gesture wasn't going to erase that. Her hands, still trembling slightly from the earlier confrontation with Tony, gripped the edges of her mug. She hadn't expected this night to turn out like this. When she had come to the diner, it was for a quiet evening alone, a chance to escape the weight of her thoughts. But now, she was in the middle of something much bigger than a simple dinner. As Jack moved back to his table, she noticed Tony glance over at her once more, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if sizing her up. She couldn't tell whether he was annoyed or just curious, but she wasn't about to stick around to find out. She had made her stand. She wasn't going to sit there waiting for another confrontation. But leaving wasn't as easy as it sounded. It felt like all the bikers in the diner had suddenly turned their attention toward her. It wasn't overt or loud. It was subtle, like they were circling her in the background. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from casual to something more charged. Rachel glanced around. The waitress, who had been so kind earlier, was avoiding her gaze now, busying herself with the counter. The other diners, mostly regulars, seemed to be quietly observing the scene. No one was going to intervene. She was on her own. A small part of her regretted not just getting up and walking out when she had the chance, but another part of her, stronger, more defiant, reminded her that she wasn't the one who had caused the problem. She had stood up for herself. She had done what needed to be done. She wasn't going to let a few bullies chase her out of her favorite place. Rachel slowly took another sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving the group of bikers. She could see Tony speaking with Jack now, and they both seemed to be in deep conversation. The rest of the group was getting quieter, sensing something had shifted in the air. Rachel could almost feel the anticipation building, like a storm was brewing. Stay calm, she reminded herself, forcing her breathing to slow. But as she watched Tony and Jack exchange words, she noticed something. Tony's body language had changed. He was leaning in, speaking more forcefully, while Jack appeared to be holding his ground. It wasn't a casual conversation anymore. It was an argument, albeit a quiet one. She couldn't hear their words, but the tension between them was palpable. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Could things escalate again? Was she about to become the center of some biker conflict she hadn't signed up for? And then, the unthinkable happened. Tony stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor loudly. He looked directly at her, his gaze cold and intense. It wasn't just annoyance. It was something darker, something dangerous. The rest of the group followed suit, their eyes flicking toward her in unison. Rachel felt her stomach lurch. She had been in tight spots before, but this was different. She could feel the weight of their stares, the way they seemed to close in on her. Jack, noticing the shift, stood up too, placing a hand on Tony's arm. "Hey, Tony, let it go," he said in a calm but firm voice. "It's not worth it." Tony shrugged off Jack's hand, his face twisted in anger. "I've had enough of this crap. This woman thinks she can come in here and tell me what to do." Rachel's heart raced. This wasn't just some minor disagreement anymore. This was a challenge, and Tony wasn't backing down. "Tony, that's enough," Jack said again, his voice a little sharper this time. Rachel's mind raced. She needed to act, and fast. She couldn't just sit there and let things get out of hand. She had no idea what they were capable of, but she wasn't going to let fear control her. Not again. Without thinking, Rachel stood up, her hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her veins. "Listen, I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice loud enough to be heard across the room. "I've said my piece. If you want to keep making a scene, that's on you. But I'm done." Tony's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, sizing her up, his gaze darkening. For a moment, the room felt like it was holding its breath. The tension was unbearable. Then, to Rachel's surprise, Jack stepped between them, facing Tony squarely. "Let it go," he repeated, his voice lower now, more commanding. "She's not the one to mess with." Rachel blinked. Jack was backing her up? She wasn't sure what to make of it, but for the first time since the bikers had walked into the diner, she felt a small sense of relief. Maybe he wasn't like the others. Maybe he was the voice of reason in this volatile situation. Tony clenched his fists, but after a long moment, he slowly sat back down, his glare still fixed on Rachel. The rest of the group followed suit, though they didn't seem particularly happy about it. Jack turned toward her, giving her a brief, almost apologetic look. "I'm sorry about that. Tony's not used to someone standing up to him like that." Rachel exhaled, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't sure if she could fully trust Jack, but for now, he had helped her avoid a confrontation. She nodded in his direction, her voice cool but grateful. "Thanks." Jack smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. "No problem. Just remember, you're not alone in this place. If you need anything, just let me know." Rachel gave him a tight smile, but she knew better than to think it was all over. The bikers might have backed off for now, but something told her this wasn't the last time she'd encounter them. What would you have done if you were in Rachel's shoes? Would you have stood up to them, or would you have tried to avoid the confrontation? Let us know in the comments. The diner had quieted down after the confrontation, but Rachel knew it wasn't really over. The bikers had returned to their food, but their eyes still lingered on her, every glance a silent reminder that things had shifted. Tony was still giving her the cold stare, and even though Jack had stepped in, she couldn't shake the feeling that the tension between them hadn't fully dissipated. She wasn't sure what Jack's role in all of this was. His intervention had been timely, but she couldn't fully trust him just yet. After all, he was part of the group, part of the same world that had made her feel like an outsider here tonight. Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor behind her. She turned to find Jack standing, his eyes briefly meeting hers before he approached the counter. "Thanks for earlier," she called out quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused, glancing back at her with a faint smile. "No problem. You don't deserve to be treated like that." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply nodded. His words were kind, but they didn't ease the unease gnawing at her insides. Jack lingered for a moment at the counter, chatting briefly with the waitress. Rachel couldn't hear what they were saying, but it seemed to be friendly enough. But then she noticed it. His body language was guarded, almost as though he were waiting for something, waiting for the storm to pass. Her eyes flicked back to the table where Tony and the rest of the bikers were seated. Tony was now leaning back in his seat, his arms crossed over his chest, but his glare was still directed toward her. His friends were quieter now, but their eyes seemed to follow her every move, as though they were trying to figure her out. Rachel's pulse quickened again. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach. They weren't done. Not by a long shot. She quickly finished her coffee and stood up, reaching for her jacket. It was better to leave before things escalated again. She wasn't afraid of a fight, but she didn't want to stick around waiting for one either. Just as she was about to head for the door, Jack's voice reached her from across the room. "You sure you're okay?" Rachel froze. She wanted to respond, but the last thing she wanted was to engage in another conversation that might just drag her deeper into the situation. Still, she couldn't just ignore him. He'd been there when it counted. "I'm fine," she replied, turning slightly to face him. "I just don't want to stick around longer than necessary." Jack gave her a small nod, as if he understood completely. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though there was something more he wanted to say, but then he simply waved it off. "Well, if you change your mind, we'll be here." Rachel didn't know whether to be relieved or more nervous. The encounter had left her with 1,000 questions. Who were these people, really? And what was Jack's true role in all of this? She walked out of the diner, the cool night air hitting her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The streets were quiet, and the neon lights from the diner reflected off the wet pavement. She wrapped her jacket tighter around her body and began walking toward her car. The peace she had sought that evening was gone. Now, all she could think about was the bikers, Tony, Jack, and the others, and the looming question of whether this was really over or if it was just the beginning of something much bigger. As Rachel reached her car, she noticed a black motorcycle parked a few spaces away. She froze for a moment, her hand still on her car door. It wasn't Jack's bike. This one was older, with worn leather saddlebags, and the helmet resting on the seat had a distinct skull sticker on it. Her instincts kicked in. The last thing she needed was to be followed or harassed further. She quickly unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind her. As she started the engine and pulled away from the curb, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced in the rearview mirror as she turned onto the main street. The motorcycle was still there, sitting motionless. Was it just coincidence? Or was someone keeping an eye on her? Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. It wasn't just the bikers she had to worry about anymore. They were a warning, a sign that this wasn't going to end quietly. Have you ever had a moment when you felt like things weren't quite finished, even though it seemed like they were? How did you handle the lingering tension? Share your thoughts in the comments. The drive back to Rachel's apartment felt longer than usual. Her thoughts spun in endless circles, each one more troubling than the last. She couldn't shake the image of that motorcycle, just sitting there, waiting for her to leave. Who was it? Was someone watching her? Was it just coincidence? Or was this a warning from Tony's gang? Her apartment was only a few miles away from the diner, but every turn she made felt like it took forever. Her mind kept racing back to the bikers, the way they had glared at her, the way Tony had spoken to her as if she owed him something. And then there was Jack. He seemed different, but could she trust him? Was he really trying to protect her, or was he just playing a part in some bigger scheme she didn't understand? Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled into the parking lot of her building. She quickly glanced around, but there was no sign of the motorcycle anymore. She exhaled, feeling a small sense of relief, but it didn't last long. Her instincts were on high alert, and she wasn't going to let her guard down just yet. She parked and sat in the car for a few extra moments, looking out the windshield, scanning the lot for any signs of danger. The only sound was the low hum of her engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Still, something felt off. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Rachel grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit her again, but it didn't offer any comfort. She locked the car behind her and began walking toward the building entrance, her eyes flicking back and forth, checking the shadows. Every step felt like it could be her last, but she didn't show it. She couldn't. She was done running from fear. As she reached the front door to the building, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Rachel pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "We know where you are." Rachel's stomach dropped. Her heart raced in panic as she looked around, but there was no one in sight. She quickly typed back, her fingers shaking. "Who is this?" The response was almost immediate. "Don't worry, you'll see us soon. We have unfinished business." A chill ran down Rachel's spine. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone, likely one of the bikers, was making sure she knew she wasn't out of their reach. She didn't have time to think. Without another moment's hesitation, Rachel bolted into the building and up the stairs to her apartment. Her pulse was pounding in her ears as she fumbled with her keys, her hands slick with sweat. She finally managed to open the door and slammed it shut behind her, locking it securely. She leaned against the door for a moment, her mind racing. Who was it? Tony? Jack? One of the other bikers? Rachel wasn't sure, but she wasn't about to wait around to find out. She grabbed her phone and quickly sent a message to her best friend, Lily. "Lily, I need your help. Can you come over? It's urgent." She hit send and dropped the phone on the couch. Then, she moved to the windows, cautiously peeking through the blinds. The street was quiet, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her phone buzzed again. It was Lily's response. "I'm on my way. What's going on?" Rachel typed back quickly. "I think I'm in danger. I don't know how to explain it, but someone is after me. I don't trust anyone." A few moments later, Lily replied, "Stay calm. I'm coming. I'll be there soon." Rachel took a deep breath. She knew Lily would come through, but even as she tried to calm her nerves, she couldn't ignore the sense of impending danger. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. It wasn't long before there was a knock at the door. Rachel jumped, but then she heard Lily's voice from the other side. "It's me, Rachel. Open up." Relieved, Rachel rushed to the door and opened it quickly. Lily stood there, her face filled with concern. "What's going on?" she asked, stepping inside. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel closed the door behind her, making sure it was locked. "I don't know how to explain it, Lily," she began, her voice shaky, "but I think I'm being followed. And I think they're with that biker gang from the diner. Tony, and maybe even Jack." Lily raised an eyebrow. "What? You're telling me this all started because of a diner confrontation?" Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. "It's not just the diner. They sent me a text. They said they know where I am. They're watching me." Lily's face grew serious. "Do you think they're going to come after you here?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted, feeling helpless, "but I don't want to wait around to find out. I need to figure out who's behind this and why they're targeting me." Lily thought for a moment, her eyes scanning Rachel's apartment. "All right, let's think this through. You can't just sit here and wait. We need to figure out what they want and how to stop it before it gets worse." Rachel nodded, grateful for Lily's level-headedness. She needed a plan. Fast. What would you do if you received a cryptic message like Rachel's, knowing that someone might be watching you? How would you handle the fear and uncertainty? Share your thoughts in the comments. The hours seemed to stretch on forever after Lily arrived. Rachel paced back and forth across her apartment, her nerves still on edge. Lily had settled on the couch, keeping an eye on the door while Rachel anxiously checked her phone every few minutes. But there were no new texts. The silence felt suffocating. "What do we do now?" Rachel asked, her voice low. "They're out there, and I don't know how to stop them. I don't even know who they really are." Lily crossed her arms, leaning back into the couch, thinking carefully. "First, let's get a handle on things. You're not alone in this, and we're not going to jump to conclusions just yet." Rachel nodded, though she couldn't shake the gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. The more she thought about it, the more everything seemed connected. Her run-in with Tony and the gang at the diner, the strange text, the sense of being watched. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. "I just don't get it," Rachel muttered. "I've never been involved in anything like this. Why would they target me?" Lily shrugged, her expression softening. "Maybe it's not about you personally. Maybe you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's usually how these things go." Rachel's mind flashed to Jack. Had he known more than he let on? He was with them, after all, yet he seemed different from the rest of them. He stepped in when things got heated at the diner, but had he been protecting her, or was he just trying to keep things under control for his own reasons? She couldn't trust him fully yet, but she also knew she didn't have many options. I don't know. There's something off about Jack, Rachel admitted, pacing again, but I don't know if I can even trust my own instincts anymore. I thought Tony was the real threat, but now I'm not so sure. Lily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. So, you think Jack might be involved in all this? I don't know, but it's possible. I don't trust anyone right now. It's like I'm stuck between two worlds, and I don't know who to turn to. Lily's eyes softened with sympathy, but she didn't look surprised. That's rough, but you're strong, Rachel. I know you can figure this out. Just stay sharp, and don't let them see you sweat. Rachel smiled weakly, grateful for Lily's unwavering support. But despite the comfort her friend provided, she still couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. The text, the motorcycle, the glares from Tony and his crew. Everything felt like it was closing in on her. The doorbell rang suddenly, making Rachel jump. Her heart raced as she turned to Lily, whose expression had gone from concern to serious in an instant. Stay quiet, Lily whispered. I'll check who it is. Rachel barely had time to react before Lily slipped off the couch and made her way quietly to the peephole. She didn't say a word, but Rachel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers clenched around the doorframe. After what felt like an eternity, Lily stepped back, her face pale. It's Jack, she said, voice low but steady. Rachel's stomach dropped. What's he doing here? I don't know, Lily replied, but we can't let him in just yet. We need to be careful. Rachel's mind raced. This was the moment. She had to decide if she was going to trust Jack or keep her distance. The decision felt heavy. She wasn't prepared for this. Could Jack be on her side? Or was he the last person she wanted to see right now? Before Rachel could speak, Jack's voice rang out through the door. Rachel, it's Jack. I need to talk to you. I know things are a little tense, but I'm not here to hurt you. Rachel froze. His voice sounded sincere, but everything about the situation felt wrong. How did he know where she lived? And why was he showing up unannounced? Lily whispered harshly, Do not open that door. Not yet. Rachel nodded, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't ignore him, but she also didn't feel ready to trust him completely. After a moment, she turned to Lily, who was still keeping watch. I need to know if he's really on my side, Rachel said, her voice tight. Can you help me figure it out? Lily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'll stay here, and you can go talk to him from the other side of the door. We'll see how he handles it. If he's really trying to help, he won't push you. Rachel took a deep breath, her mind running through 1,000 possibilities. She didn't want to open the door, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Jack had information she needed. Information that could help her get to the bottom of what was happening. Okay, Rachel said, steeling herself, but we need to be careful. She slowly walked over to the door and opened it just a crack, peering through the small gap to see Jack standing there. His eyes met hers, a mixture of concern and something else. Guilt? Was it just an act? You're not going to believe what's happening, Rachel, Jack said, his voice low. But I need you to trust me. I'm here to help. They're going to come for you if you don't let me in. Rachel's heart raced as she processed his words. His tone was calm, but there was an urgency behind it. She was about to respond when she heard the sound of a motorcycle revving in the distance. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She glanced toward the window and saw the faint shadow of a figure moving quickly toward her building. They're here, Jack said quietly. We need to talk. Now. If you were in Rachel's shoes, would you open the door to Jack and trust him, or would you keep your guard up? Why? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Rachel hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Her eyes flicked from Jack's anxious expression to the window where the motorcycle revved louder. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was coming, and she had no time to waste. She looked at Lily, who stood a few feet away, eyes narrowed in suspicion. What do you think? Rachel whispered. Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't like it. But if Jack's telling the truth, you need to know what's going on. You've got to hear him out, but keep your guard up. We don't know if he's really on your side. Rachel nodded, the tension in her chest tightening. She wanted to believe Jack, but her trust in him was fragile. Every moment she waited could make things worse. She took a deep breath, then swung the door open just enough to let Jack step inside. But she didn't step back. "You've got 5 minutes," she said, her voice firm. "Tell me what's going on, and make it quick." Jack glanced behind him, then moved into the apartment, his eyes scanning the room with quick, practiced movements. He closed the door behind him, his gaze flicking to Lily, who hadn't moved from her spot by the couch. "I didn't come here to put you in more danger, Rachel," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "But I need you to understand that this is bigger than you think." Rachel crossed her arms, her gaze never leaving his. "Then start talking. Who's after me? And why are you involved?" Jack took a deep breath, clearly struggling with how much to say. "It's Tony. He's part of a larger operation, one that involves some powerful people. I wasn't supposed to be part of this, but I got pulled in." He paused, looking almost ashamed. "I didn't want you to get caught up in it. But you're in the middle of something dangerous now." Rachel's mind raced as she processed his words. "You're telling me Tony is connected to something bigger? How do you know all this?" Jack lowered his voice, glancing once more at the door. "I used to run with him and his crew. I wasn't involved in their business, but I got close to him. I tried to get out a while ago, but it's not easy to walk away from someone like Tony." A chill ran down Rachel's spine. Jack's words confirmed her worst fears. Tony was deeper in something dangerous than she could have imagined. "So why are you here? Why should I trust you?" Jack took a step forward, his expression serious. "Because I'm trying to help you. I didn't think they'd come after you, but now they know you're a loose end. They want to make sure you don't tell anyone what you know. They're scared of you talking." Rachel shook her head, still skeptical. "Talking about what?" Before Jack could respond, there was a knock at the door. Rachel's heart jumped in her chest. Was it more bikers? Was Tony sending someone else to threaten her? If you were in Rachel's shoes, would you open the door to Jack and trust him, or would you keep your guard up? Why? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Rachel hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Her eyes flicked from Jack's anxious expression to the window where the motorcycle revved louder. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was coming, and she had no time to waste. She looked at Lily, who stood a few feet away, eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What do you think?" Rachel whispered. Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't like it. But if Jack's telling the truth, you need to know what's going on. You've got to hear him out, but keep your guard up. We don't know if he's really on your side." Rachel nodded, the tension in her chest tightening. She wanted to believe Jack, but her trust in him was fragile. Every moment she waited could make things worse. She took a deep breath, then swung the door open just enough to let Jack step inside. But she didn't step back. "You've got 5 minutes," she said, her voice firm. "Tell me what's going on, and make it quick." Jack glanced behind him, then moved into the apartment, his eyes scanning the room with quick, practiced movements. He closed the door behind him, his gaze flicking to Lily, who hadn't moved from her spot by the couch. "I didn't come here to put you in more danger, Rachel," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "But I need you to understand that this is bigger than you think." Rachel crossed her arms, her gaze never leaving his. "Then start talking. Who's after me? And why are you involved?" Jack took a deep breath, clearly struggling with how much to say. "It's Tony. He's part of a larger operation, one that involves some powerful people. I wasn't supposed to be part of this, but I got pulled in." He paused, looking almost ashamed. "I didn't want you to get caught up in it. But you're in the middle of something dangerous now." Rachel's mind raced as she processed his words. "You're telling me Tony is connected to something bigger? How do you know all this?" Jack lowered his voice, glancing once more at the door. "I used to run with him and his crew. I wasn't involved in their business, but I got close to him. I tried to get out a while ago, but it's not easy to walk away from someone like Tony." A chill ran down Rachel's spine. Jack's words confirmed her worst fears. Tony was deeper in something dangerous than she could have imagined. "So why are you here? Why should I trust you?" Jack took a step forward, his expression serious. Because I'm trying to help you. I didn't think they'd come after you. But now they know you're a loose end. They want to make sure you don't tell anyone what you know. They're scared of you talking. Rachel shook her head, still skeptical. Talking about what? Before Jack could respond, there was a knock at the door. Rachel's heart jumped in her chest. Was it more bikers? Was Tony sending someone else to threaten her? Lily moved closer to the door, her stance defensive. You need to get out of here. I'm not buying this, Jack. No one just helps without a reason. Jack stepped back quickly. I'm not here to hurt you, but you need to understand that the situation is worse than you think. They're not going to stop until they make sure you stay quiet. Rachel's mind spun. She was still piecing everything together, but one thing was clear now. Jack wasn't just a bystander. He was entangled in all of this. And if she didn't figure out what Tony's gang wanted from her, she might be in deeper trouble than she realized. The knock at the door came again, this time louder and more urgent. Rachel turned to Lily, her heart racing. We need to make a decision now. Lily nodded, then turned back to Jack. Do you know who's out there? Jack's face darkened. I think it's one of Tony's men. Maybe even Tony himself. A knot formed in Rachel's stomach. What do we do? Jack glanced quickly around the room, then stepped toward the back window. We don't have much time. We need to move now. Before Rachel could ask another question, Jack grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the window. Lily was already at her side, her face tense with worry. You two need to come with me, Jack said, his voice low. If you stay here, they'll find you. You have to trust me. Rachel didn't have a choice. She nodded, her mind still reeling as Jack led them toward the window. Her thoughts raced. What was happening? Was she truly in danger? And more importantly, who could she trust? The night outside was dark, and Rachel could hear the sound of footsteps in the hall, a voice murmuring just beyond the door. She was trapped, and the walls were closing in. They slipped quietly through the window, stepping out onto the fire escape. Rachel's heart pounded as she clung to the railing. The cool night air hit her face, but it did little to calm her nerves. Every muscle in her body was on edge, every shadow on the street seeming like a threat. We need to go fast, Jack said, his voice urgent. I'll take you somewhere safe. Rachel didn't ask where. She didn't care. She just needed to get away. Her thoughts raced as they made their way down the fire escape, her legs trembling with fear and uncertainty. As they reached the bottom, they hurried across the street, keeping low to avoid being seen. But as they turned the corner, Rachel froze. The motorcycle was parked across the street from her building, its engine running. The rider sat there, waiting. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It's them, she whispered. Jack looked over his shoulder, his face grim. We're not safe yet. Keep moving. But Rachel couldn't tear her eyes away from the motorcycle. The rider hadn't moved, but she could feel the eyes of the gang member on her. And she realized then, this was no longer just about Tony's gang. It was bigger than that. It was about power, control, and survival. And she had just stepped into the middle of it. What would you do if you were Rachel, running for your life while unsure who to trust? Would you go with Jack, or try to find a way to escape on your own? Let us know in the comments. Rachel's heart raced as she glanced back at the motorcycle, the figure still sitting motionless on it. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from him as possible, but Jack was already pulling her away, urging her to move faster. Come on, we can't stay here. They know we're on the move now, Jack muttered, pulling her through an alleyway. Lily was a few steps behind, but she kept pace, her eyes darting around, scanning for any sign of danger. The sounds of the city seemed to fade as Rachel's focus narrowed on the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't sure where they were going, or if Jack could be trusted, but the danger behind them felt too real to ignore. Rachel's mind raced. Who was that man on the bike? And why had Jack suddenly decided to help her? He had seemed so distant and cold before, and now he was guiding them through the shadows like a man with a plan. Was he leading them into a trap, or had something changed? Where are we going? Rachel asked breathlessly, her voice tight with fear. Jack didn't answer right away. He kept pulling them through the narrow alleys, his pace quickening. We're going to a place where they won't find us. Trust me, it's the safest option for now. Rachel didn't have much of a choice. She had no idea where they were heading, but she could feel her heart thudding louder with each step. The uncertainty gnawed at her. As they made their way through the back streets, Rachel realized just how far they had strayed from her apartment building. The darkened city seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the quiet hum of distant traffic felt like a hollow echo. Jack stopped suddenly in front of an old, weathered building with a rusty iron gate blocking the entrance. He turned to Rachel and Lily, his face serious. "We'll be safe here for now," Jack said, his voice low. "It's an old friend of mine who runs a place like this, kind of a safe house for people who need to lay low. They won't know we're here." Rachel glanced at Lily, who seemed equally wary but was clearly trying to stay calm. "And this friend of yours, Jack? Are we supposed to trust him too?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Jack gave a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't have much choice. If you want to stay off their radar, we don't have time to look for other options." Lily raised an eyebrow. "I'm starting to think we don't have much of a choice about anything right now." Before Rachel could respond, Jack pushed open the rusted gate, revealing a small courtyard. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dim lights flickered in the windows of the building, casting eerie shadows. It felt abandoned, but somehow it also felt safe, like no one would think to look there. They hurried inside, and Jack motioned for them to follow him through the narrow corridor. The place was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath their feet. As they reached the end of the hallway, Jack opened a door to a small, dimly lit room. "We'll stay here for the night. You two should rest up," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. Rachel walked in cautiously, her eyes scanning the sparse room. There was a small bed in the corner, a dresser, and a single window that was covered with thick curtains. It looked like a temporary hiding place. Nothing permanent, just enough to keep them out of sight for a while. Lily immediately walked over to the bed and sat down, letting out a long sigh. "This is getting ridiculous," she muttered, rubbing her eyes. "We've got Tony and his gang chasing us, and now we're trusting some guy who used to work with them?" Rachel sat down next to Lily, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She couldn't stop her mind from racing. Was Jack really trying to protect her? Or was he playing both sides? "What do you think?" Rachel asked, her voice low. "Can we trust him?" Lily didn't answer immediately. She seemed deep in thought, clearly wrestling with her own doubts. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now. "I think Jack is in over his head. But right now, he's our best option. I don't trust him completely either, but he's been helpful. If he was planning something bad, he would have done it by now." Rachel nodded slowly. She didn't feel entirely convinced, but at least for the moment, she didn't have any better options. Suddenly, Jack's voice broke through the silence, sharp and urgent. "We need to talk. I'm going to be straight with you both now. They're not just going to stop after one attempt. This is bigger than Tony. There are people involved who—" Before Jack could finish, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. The door to their room was slammed open, and Rachel's heart jumped into her throat. In the doorway stood two men, both tall and heavily built. Their eyes glinted with malice as they stepped into the room, their hands resting casually on their belts where weapons were holstered. Jack's expression didn't change, but Rachel could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. "I told you it wouldn't be long before they found us," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Lily stood up quickly, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something, anything, to defend herself. But there was nothing. The larger of the two men spoke first, his voice gravelly and low. "Jack, you know we can't let this slide. Tony's orders are clear. No loose ends." Jack didn't move. He stood still, a calm presence in the chaos. "I'm not a loose end. I'm here to protect them. You're not getting through me." Rachel felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She wanted to shout, to demand answers, but she knew better than to provoke these men. The second man, shorter but just as intimidating, grinned. "Tony doesn't like being crossed, Jack. You've made a mistake." Jack stood firm. "I'm not afraid of Tony, and neither are they." The tension in the room thickened, and Rachel's mind spun. She had no idea what was about to happen, but one thing was clear. If they didn't act fast, they might not get another chance. What would you do if you were in Rachel's position right now? Would you trust Jack to handle the situation? Or try to find a way out yourself? Let us know your thoughts. Rachel's mind raced as she faced the two men who had just barged into the room. The weight of the situation pressed on her chest like a vice, making it hard to breathe. Every instinct told her to run, to escape while there was still a chance. But where would they go? The alleyways? The street? Everywhere felt like a trap. Jack's calm demeanor was unnerving. He didn't flinch when the men entered. He didn't even take a step back. Rachel's eyes flicked between him and the two intimidating figures standing in the doorway, the menacing atmosphere thick in the air. The larger of the two men, a hulking figure with a thick beard and a scar running across his jaw, took a step forward. "You're really going to stand in the way of Tony's orders, Jack? You've gone soft." Jack's eyes didn't leave the man's face. "I'm not doing this for Tony. I'm doing this for them," he said, gesturing to Rachel and Lily, who were standing behind him, trying to remain out of the line of sight. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt them." The shorter man, who had a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes, took a few steps into the room. "You think Tony cares about you playing hero? You're just a liability now. You've put your neck out for these two, and that's going to cost you. It's already too late to walk away." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She could hear the threat in the man's voice, and the coldness in his words made her blood run cold. There was no turning back now. Lily moved quietly, positioning herself just behind Jack. She had a sharp look in her eyes, ready to take action. But Rachel could see the unease in her expression, the uncertainty of what was about to happen. "We don't have to do this," Jack said suddenly, his voice firm. "I can walk away, and you can tell Tony that. But if you're smart, you'll let them go." The bigger man let out a low laugh. "Smart? You think Tony's gonna let you walk away just like that? After all this time? You're dreaming, Jack." Rachel's pulse quickened. This was happening, right here, right now. It didn't feel real. She hadn't expected it to go down like this. She glanced toward the window, but there was no escape through it. Not unless she wanted to take a leap of faith that could very well break her bones. And running out the door wasn't an option either. Lily's hand brushed Rachel's, a silent signal. Whatever happened next, they needed to be ready. "Jack's right," Lily spoke up, her voice steady but cold. "You don't have to do this. Just leave. We'll go our separate ways." The two men exchanged a look, and for a moment, Rachel thought they might actually walk away. But then, the taller man's grin widened, and his gaze shifted to Jack. "You don't get it, do you? We're not here for them. We're here for you, Jack." Rachel's stomach dropped. This wasn't about her or Lily. They were just pawns in a bigger game. Jack had been the real target all along. Without warning, the shorter man lunged forward, moving with surprising speed. Jack reacted just in time, sidestepping and grabbing the man's arm, twisting it behind his back. The move was quick, fluid. Jack wasn't just a bystander in this fight. He knew how to handle himself. But the larger man wasn't waiting for his partner to get pinned. He rushed toward Jack, fists raised, a brutal expression on his face. Jack barely had time to react before a fist collided with his shoulder, sending him stumbling back. Rachel's heart pounded as she watched the fight unfold. She had to do something. They couldn't let Jack go down. He was their only shot at survival. She glanced around, her eyes searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Lily moved like lightning. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and swung it at the larger man, hitting him across the back of the head. The impact made him stagger, but he didn't go down. "Get down!" Lily shouted to Rachel, as she shoved the lamp into the man's hands and used her own momentum to push him away. Rachel barely had time to react before the smaller man shoved Jack into a wall. The impact shook the room, but Jack managed to regain his balance. He blocked the next punch just in time, grabbing the man by the collar and throwing him toward the door. The man hit the floor with a grunt, dazed but not out. "That's it," the larger man growled, wiping blood from his lip. He didn't bother with words anymore. He moved forward, eyes narrowing with rage. Rachel's chest tightened. This was it. If they didn't get out now, they were going to be caught in a fight that neither side could win. "Jack!" Rachel shouted, her voice filled with desperation. "We can't fight them. We need to get out of here now." Jack's eyes met hers. They were full of determination, but also the weariness of someone who had fought for too long. He nodded quickly, but his gaze shifted to the door. They couldn't leave the building. The men had it surrounded. They were trapped. "We need to stall them," Jack muttered. "Lily, you're fast. Get to the kitchen. Look for anything that can help. I'll handle these two." Lily nodded without hesitation, moving toward the kitchen as Jack squared off against the larger man, preparing for the next round of the fight. Rachel's heart pounded as she backed away toward the window, her mind racing. They had to think of something. They couldn't win a fight like this, but if they could just escape, just long enough to get away. But escape was no longer a simple option. The fight had escalated far beyond what she'd imagined. The stakes were higher now, and she could feel the weight of that knowledge bearing down on her. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced through the air, distant at first, but growing louder with every second. Rachel's eyes widened. Was it the police? Had someone heard the commotion? "Jack, listen!" she shouted, her voice filled with hope. "The sirens, they're coming. We've got to get out of here." Jack hesitated, looking around for a moment before making a decision. "Lily," he yelled, "we're out of time. Grab what you can and let's go." But before they could act, the two men took a step closer, a dangerous glint in their eyes. The sirens weren't enough to save them. Not yet. Rachel felt her stomach drop as the larger man lunged at Jack, throwing a wild punch. The battle for survival had just taken a deadly turn. If you were in Rachel's shoes, would you stay and help fight? Or would you take the opportunity to escape while the sirens were still approaching? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The sirens grew louder, and for a fleeting moment, hope surged through Rachel's chest. But it wasn't enough to make the danger go away. The men weren't backing down, and Jack and Lily were outnumbered and outmatched. Rachel's mind raced. What can I do? She could see Jack struggling to hold his ground, his face set with determination, but she knew he couldn't fight both of them off for long. The sirens might be closing in, but they were still far enough away for the men to make a move before the police arrived. She had to act fast. "Jack!" she shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to get out now." Jack glanced over at her, his eyes narrowed with both frustration and resolve. "The door's blocked. We have no choice but to fight them off, at least until the sirens get closer. Stay back, Rachel." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't about to sit back and wait while Jack and Lily fought for their lives. She had to help. She scanned the room, looking for anything that could give them an edge. The lamp Lily had thrown lay on the floor near the entrance, but it was no use now. She needed something more. Her eyes fell on the kitchen door, slightly ajar. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a desperate idea. "Lily," she called out. "The kitchen. Find something heavy. Anything." Lily, who had been backing up toward the kitchen, nodded and darted into the room without hesitation. Jack continued to hold off the larger man, dodging punches and kicks. The shorter man circled around, waiting for an opening. But Jack was fast. Despite being outnumbered, he was making them work for every inch. Rachel took a breath and grabbed a nearby metal chair. It was heavy, awkward, but it would do. She held it tightly in her hands, her palms sweating. The sound of crashing fists and grunts filled the room as the fight raged on. Rachel took a step forward, but before she could make her move, the larger man saw her and charged. Jack shouted in warning, but it was too late. The man slammed into Rachel, knocking the chair out of her hands and sending her stumbling backward. Her breath left her in a rush as she crashed into the wall, pain shooting through her side. "Rachel!" Jack shouted, his voice filled with concern. But Rachel gritted her teeth and pushed herself up. She couldn't afford to be weak now, not when everything was on the line. The sound of the sirens was getting closer, but it wasn't enough yet. She needed to help them break free. Just as the large man took another step toward her, something crashed behind him. Lily emerged from the kitchen, a heavy frying pan in hand. Without thinking, she swung it hard, hitting the man across the back. He grunted in surprise, stumbling forward. "Go!" Lily shouted, holding the frying pan up defensively. "I'll keep him distracted." Rachel didn't waste a second. She rushed toward Jack, grabbing his arm. We need to move, Jack. We can't stay here. But just as they began to make a run for the door, the shorter man lunged, grabbing Jack by the arm and yanking him back into the center of the room. The two men were closing in on them again. The sirens, while closer, were still too far away to offer real protection. Jack fought back, but he was starting to wear down. The larger man, now recovering from the frying pan blow, came at them with a brutal snarl. Rachel could see it in his eyes, the violence, the desperation. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed open, and a voice rang out, commanding and forceful. Freeze! All three of them turned to see two police officers standing in the doorway, their guns drawn. One was a tall woman with dark hair, the other a broad-shouldered man. The officers immediately assessed the scene, taking in the fighting and the tension in the room. Hands where I can see them, the woman barked, pointing her weapon at the two men. The larger man hesitated, looking between the officers and Jack, then at Rachel and Lily, who were still standing at the edge of the room. For a split second, it looked like he might charge. But then, the sound of more sirens approached, and the two men seemed to realize their time was up. Without a word, the shorter man grabbed the larger one's arm and yanked him toward the exit. They didn't waste another moment. Both men bolted, disappearing into the shadows of the street. The police officers didn't pursue. They kept their guns trained on the door, ready for anything. The woman officer, still tense, lowered her weapon slightly, but kept a sharp eye on the room. Are you two okay? The man officer asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. He didn't relax fully, but his posture shifted as he took in the situation. We heard the commotion. We were about to call for backup. Rachel exhaled, her legs shaking with the adrenaline finally catching up to her. She looked at Jack, who was still standing, barely a mark on him despite the fight. He was focused, always focused. His jaw was set, but he seemed to relax just a little when he saw the officers. We're fine, Jack said, his voice steady. Those two men were just trying to intimidate us. The female officer didn't seem entirely convinced. And who are you exactly? She asked, her eyes narrowing. Why were those men after you? Jack looked at Rachel, then at Lily, as if weighing his words carefully. He knew they couldn't reveal everything to the police. Not yet. They had to stay careful, especially with Tony's people out there. We'll explain everything, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. But right now, we need to get out of here before they come back with more men. The officers exchanged a brief look. Finally, the woman officer spoke. We'll escort you. But if you know anything about these men, we need a full report. Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of everything pressing on her chest. She wasn't sure what the next steps were, but the immediate danger had passed, and for that, she was grateful. Thank you, she said to the officers, her voice shaky but sincere. We don't know everything, but we'll tell you what we can. The police officers gestured for them to move toward the door. Come on, let's get you out of here. And if you want to be safe, you'll stay with us until we get this sorted. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit Rachel, filling her lungs with the fresh, crisp scent of the city. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. They were still alive. Do you think Rachel and Jack can fully trust the police officers? Or do you think the police might be hiding something? Let us know your thoughts below. The street outside was quiet, save for the distant hum of city traffic and the occasional honk of a horn. Rachel's heart still pounded in her chest, but the adrenaline from the fight had begun to subside, leaving behind a heavy sense of unease. The officers guided them down the street, leading them toward their patrol car, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. Jack walked beside her, his expression still intense, his eyes scanning every passing car, every figure in the distance. Lily was a few steps behind them, her face tight, though she'd managed to remain calm through the chaos. Rachel felt a fleeting sense of relief. They had made it out alive, but the nagging thought in the back of her mind refused to let her fully relax. The officers led them to a patrol car parked at the curb. The woman officer opened the back door, gesturing for them to get inside. Get in. We'll take you to the station. We'll figure out what's going on from there, she said, her tone less harsh than it had been inside the restaurant. Rachel hesitated, looking around. Are we safe here? I mean, are we sure they're gone? She asked, her voice laced with caution. The male officer, a burly man with a stubble beard, gave her a reassuring nod. For now, you are. But we can't take any chances. We're going to keep you under protection until we get this sorted out. Jack glanced at the officer but said nothing. Instead, he climbed into the car, his movements stiff, as if every muscle in his body was coiled with tension. Lily followed, taking a seat next to Rachel, who slid in beside her, still unsure of what to think. Were they really safe now? The woman officer slammed the door behind them with a soft thud, and the car pulled away from the curb, heading down the street toward the police station. Rachel leaned back against the cool seat, her mind whirring with questions. What had those men wanted with Jack? Why had they come after him? And, most importantly, who else was involved in all of this? She glanced at Jack, hoping to get some answers. Do you know who they were? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Who sent them after you? Jack didn't immediately answer. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. Rachel knew better than to press him too hard, but the silence was unbearable. It's not safe yet, Jack finally said, his voice low and measured. Those guys? They were sent by someone dangerous. If they're here, it means something bigger is going down. Rachel's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Who are they working for? Before Jack could answer, the male officer spoke up from the front, his voice gruff. You don't need to know all the details right now. What matters is that we get you to safety. We're going to make sure you're protected. Rachel didn't know what to make of his words. The police seemed to be taking control of the situation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She exchanged a glance with Lily, who seemed just as wary. Something in her eyes told Rachel that Lily felt it too. The weight of the unsaid, the lingering suspicion that the officers might not be as trustworthy as they appeared. Jack's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, and Rachel could tell he was thinking the same thing. The situation felt too easy, too smooth. The officers were doing everything by the book, but there was a coldness to them, a certain detachment that made Rachel question whether they were just doing their job, or if they were playing a bigger part in this story. The ride to the station was short, but it felt like an eternity. When the car finally pulled up to the precinct, the officers motioned for them to get out. The building loomed ahead, dark and imposing under the dim streetlights. Rachel followed Jack and Lily out of the car, her senses on high alert. Every footstep, every sound in the night air, made her jump. As they walked inside, a chill ran down Rachel's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that there was more to this story than they knew. The officers led them through a series of corridors, past security stations, until they reached a small conference room. It was stark and sterile, nothing like the warmth of the restaurant they'd just escaped from. The woman officer took a seat at the table and looked at them, her face unreadable. We need to talk about what happened tonight, she said, her tone flat. And we need to figure out who's after you and why. Rachel nodded, but she couldn't help the suspicion that curled in her stomach. Before we get into that, I have a question. The officer raised an eyebrow, as if intrigued. What is it? Rachel leaned forward, her voice steady but edged with concern. How do we know we can trust you? What's stopping us from being just another set of victims in whatever mess you're all involved in? For the first time, the officer's expression shifted, though it was subtle. She glanced at her partner, then back at Rachel. Listen, she said, her voice softening slightly. I get that you're scared. This isn't easy. But you need to understand something. This isn't just a case of a few guys causing trouble. This goes much deeper. Lily shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? The officer sighed. We don't have all the details yet. But we're not just dealing with some small-time gang. Tony Marino? That name ring a bell? Rachel's stomach dropped at the mention of Tony, the same name that had been on Jack's lips earlier, the same name that had haunted their every move. Tony Marino? Rachel whispered. He's the one behind this? The officer nodded. We've been tracking him for years. He's connected to a much larger operation, drugs, weapons, human trafficking, and it looks like you too, well, you've become targets because of it. Rachel's mind spun. She had known something bigger was happening, But this was beyond anything she had imagined. Jack's voice broke through her thoughts. So, what now? You're saying we're just collateral damage in your investigation? The officer leaned forward, her expression serious. I'm saying that right now. You're at the center of something much bigger than you know. But you're not alone in this. We can help you, but only if you trust us. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. The walls around her seemed to close in. She had to make a choice. Trust. Do you think Rachel and Jack should trust the officers, or is this just another trap? What would you do in their situation? Let us know your thoughts below. The tension in the small room was thick, like a fog that refused to lift. Rachel sat across from the two officers, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel Jack's eyes on her, steady and full of a kind of silent understanding. They both knew they were caught in something much larger than they could have ever imagined. But the question remained. Who could they trust? The officer who had spoken first, Detective Sarah Miles, was watching them closely, her eyes sharp. Her partner, Officer David Collins, stood by the door, arms crossed, looking more like a bodyguard than a cop. Rachel could see the tightness in his posture, the way his eyes darted around, constantly scanning for any potential threat. Was it a sign of vigilance, or was he just as trapped in this situation as they were? So, what happens now? Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her insides. You want us to trust you? After everything that's happened tonight? Detective Miles exhaled slowly, her hands folding on the table. I know this sounds crazy, but I'm telling you the truth. We don't have the whole picture yet, but what we do know is that you're involved in something dangerous. Something much bigger than what you've seen so far. And we need your help to stop it. Rachel's mind reeled. Help them? She barely understood what was going on herself. She glanced at Jack, who was still silent, but his eyes were full of questions, just like hers. They had no choice but to listen. Why us? Jack finally spoke, his voice low but firm. Why would Marino's people come after us? We don't know anything about what they're doing. Detective Miles leaned forward, her gaze never leaving them. That's the part we don't fully understand either. Marino has connections in all sorts of illegal activities, but he's also got his hands in the local businesses, restaurants, bars, even construction companies. The fact that you two were targeted means either someone wanted to send a message, or you stumbled onto something you shouldn't have. Rachel could feel the weight of her own words as she spoke. We've been running for a while now. It's not just tonight. We've been getting threats for weeks. And tonight, I don't know. Everything just exploded. Exploded how? Officer Collins chimed in, his voice gruff. Rachel swallowed hard, her mind flashing back to the moment when the bikers first barged into the restaurant, their aggressive postures and threatening glances. The bikers, they came in, started making trouble. Then, when Jack and I tried to leave, they came after us. They wouldn't let us go. Did they say anything? Detective Miles pressed, her eyes narrowing with focus. Rachel paused, trying to piece together the chaos of the night. Not much. They were just looking for trouble, and when Jack fought back, it escalated. And then those guys outside, Jack added, his tone cold. They were part of Marino's crew. I know that much. But why did they come after us specifically? Detective Miles nodded slowly, as if processing everything they had said. You're right to be suspicious. We're still piecing things together, but I think you've stumbled into something that's going to get worse before it gets better. The silence hung in the air for a moment, and Rachel could feel her anxiety bubbling up again. She had always been the type to keep moving, to escape, but this felt like a web of lies and danger that she couldn't outrun. She had no idea how deep it went, but there was a sinking feeling in her stomach that told her they were already in too deep. So what now? Lily's voice interrupted, cutting through the tension. She had been quiet until now, but Rachel could see the worry in her eyes. You want us to cooperate, but how do we even know you're not working for Marino too? For all we know, you could be just another part of his operation. Detective Miles's face tightened, but she didn't flinch. I get why you'd think that, but you need to trust me when I say we're not working for Marino. We've been tracking his network for months, and we're finally closing in on him. But he's dangerous. If you're involved, it's only going to get worse before it gets better. Rachel could feel the weight of those words, the heaviness in her chest as the gravity of the situation set in. She had known something was off about the whole thing. The bikers, the random encounters, the sense that they were being followed. But hearing it from the officers only confirmed her worst fears. "So what's the plan?" Jack asked, his voice calm but sharp. "You want us to help you take him down? Just like that?" Detective Miles nodded, but it was clear this wasn't a simple ask. "Yes, we need your help, but not in the way you think. We need information. Anything you know about Marino, his associates, his operations. You don't have to get involved directly, but we need to piece together everything we can before he disappears again." Jack and Rachel exchanged a look. It felt like an impossible choice. Help these officers, who might be their only shot at surviving this, or risk everything by staying silent and running. The reality was, they were already in danger, whether they cooperated or not. "I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in getting more involved with Marino's people," Jack said, his voice firm. "But we can't just sit here while they come for us. We'll give you whatever we know." Lily nodded, her face set in determination. "We've been on the run for weeks. We've seen enough to know we can't just ignore this anymore." Detective Miles seemed to relax, just slightly, as if their decision had solidified something in her mind. "Good. You're making the right choice. We'll keep you safe for now, but we need to act fast. Marino's people are ruthless." As she spoke, Rachel felt the weight of her own fear pressing down harder. Ruthless. That word echoed in her mind as she thought of everything they'd already been through. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back, taking control of their own fates. Detective Miles stood, moving toward the door. "Get some rest while we handle things here. We'll talk more in the morning. But I'm serious. Keep your guard up. Don't trust anyone." Rachel watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. For a moment, she and Jack were left in the cold, quiet room. Everything felt uncertain, but one thing was clear. They had no choice but to see this through. "I don't like it," Jack said, breaking the silence. "But we don't have much of a choice, do we?" Rachel shook her head. "No, we don't." "Do you think Rachel and Jack made the right decision by agreeing to help the police? Or do you think they should have walked away and tried to handle it on their own? Let us know your thoughts below." The next morning came too quickly for Rachel, and the weight of the previous night lingered like a shadow. She woke up in a small holding room at the precinct, the sterile white walls seeming to close in around her. Her body ached from the adrenaline, and the sleepless night had left her feeling drained. She hadn't expected things to get this complicated. Beside her, Jack was already up, pacing in the small space. His shoulders were tense, his movements quick and restless. He hadn't said much since their conversation with Detective Miles and Officer Collins. They'd both agreed to help, but Rachel knew Jack. He wasn't one to trust easily, and this situation was anything but normal. "I can't shake this feeling," Jack muttered, his voice low. "Something about all of this doesn't add up." Rachel nodded, rubbing her temples. She felt the same way. Every part of her screamed to run. Run far and fast, as far away from Marino and the officers as possible. But there was no running anymore. They were already too involved, and now they had to face the consequences. "I know," Rachel said, her voice hoarse, "but we don't have a choice. We help them, or we end up on the run forever." Jack stopped pacing, his gaze locking with hers. "I'm not sure we have much of a future, even if we do help them. If Marino's people are as dangerous as they say, I don't think we're walking out of this untouched." Rachel met his eyes, her heart racing. It wasn't something she wanted to admit, but she knew deep down he was right. They were already in too deep, and the only way out now was to play this game to its end. Before she could respond, the door to the room opened, and Detective Miles stepped in. She didn't look surprised to find them awake, but there was a weary edge to her expression. She seemed just as on edge as they were. "Ready to go?" she asked, her voice clipped. Rachel and Jack exchanged a look, and without saying another word, they stood up. They had made the decision to help, and now they were going to see it through. Detective Miles led them down a series of sterile hallways, the echo of their footsteps bouncing off the walls. Rachel's stomach twisted with nerves. This was it. There was no turning back. As they neared the exit, Officer Collins appeared, looking just as serious as ever. He gave a curt nod to Rachel and Jack, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Let's get going," he said, ushering them out of the building and into the parking lot. The sun was already high in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the city around them was waking up, oblivious to the danger Rachel and Jack had found themselves caught in. The officers led them to a nondescript black SUV parked at the curb. As they approached, Rachel felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just a ride to safety. This was the start of something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Once inside, the vehicle hummed to life, and they began driving through the city streets. The ride was silent except for the occasional murmur between Detective Miles and Officer Collins. Rachel tried to catch a glimpse of the direction they were headed, but the turns and twists were so fast, she couldn't tell if they were being led into a trap or towards safety. Finally, they stopped in front of an unmarked building. The area was quiet, industrial, a far cry from the bustling streets of downtown. There were no signs, no indication of what was inside. Just a tall metal door, guarded by two men in dark suits who stood at attention. "This is where things get real," Detective Miles said as she led them out of the SUV and toward the door. "You're going to meet with someone who has the answers to what's going on. He's a part of the task force, but you need to be on your guard. This isn't your typical police operation." Rachel's heart thudded in her chest as they entered the building. The inside was just as stark and cold as the exterior. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the sound of distant voices echoed down the narrow hallway. They moved swiftly through the corridors, passing locked doors and rooms filled with computers. Everything about this place screamed secrecy. They stopped in front of a plain wooden door. Detective Miles knocked twice before opening it and ushering them inside. The man sitting behind the desk didn't look like the kind of person who worked in a police station. He was older, his face lined with age, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made Rachel uneasy. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a plain shirt and dark slacks. His sharp eyes fixed on them as they entered, and Rachel instantly felt like she was under a microscope. "Rachel, Jack, this is Agent Harlan Reed," Detective Miles said. "He's the one who's been tracking Marino's operations. He's the one who can give you the answers you're looking for." Agent Reed stood up, offering a handshake that felt both professional and calculating. "Nice to meet you. I wish it were under better circumstances." Rachel shook his hand, trying not to let her nerves show. She wasn't sure if she trusted this man, but she didn't have much of a choice. "So, what's the plan?" Jack asked, his voice blunt, cutting through the tension in the room. Reed sat back down, motioning for them to take a seat. "We're going after Marino, but I'll be honest with you, it's not going to be easy. Marino has eyes everywhere. He's got a whole network of people working for him. If you're going to help us, you'll need to be prepared for what's coming." Rachel's mind raced. She had already known the situation was dire, but hearing it from someone who was clearly deep in the investigation made everything feel even more real. "And what do you need from us?" Rachel asked, trying to steady her voice. Reed glanced at Detective Miles before answering. "We need information. Anything you can tell us about Marino's associates, his movements, anything. You've already seen what he's capable of. This is about more than just surviving now. We need to take him down before he causes any more destruction." Jack leaned forward, his jaw clenched. "So, you're asking us to put ourselves in the line of fire again? After everything that's happened?" Reed met Jack's gaze. "Yes, but this time, you won't be alone. We're not asking you to go in blind. We'll protect you, but you have to help us connect the dots." Rachel exchanged a glance with Jack. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, but they both knew there was no other choice. They couldn't just sit back and let Marino's network continue to grow. If they didn't act now, it would be too late. "All right," Jack said finally, his voice low but determined. "We're in." "Do you think Rachel and Jack are making the right choice by getting involved in the task force's operation? Or should they have walked away and try to go underground instead? Share your thoughts below. The air in the small conference room was thick with tension as Agent Reed laid out the plan. Rachel and Jack sat at a metal table, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Detective Miles and Officer Collins stood off to the side, their faces unreadable. Here's the situation, Agent Reed began, his voice calm and steady, a sharp contrast to the chaos in Rachel's mind. Marino's operation is vast, spanning multiple illegal businesses, drugs, arms, gambling, and even money laundering. But the key to bringing him down is his ties to the city's infrastructure, especially local businesses. If we can cut off his cash flow and take down his key players, we can destabilize his entire network. Rachel listened intently, her mind processing the information, but it was hard to keep up. Marino wasn't just a gangster. He was a monster, an entire empire built on greed and destruction. Your part in this is simple, Reed continued. We need you to work with us to infiltrate some of his inner circles. You've already crossed paths with a few of his associates. Now, we need to use that to our advantage. Jack shot Rachel a look. She could see the skepticism in his eyes. This wasn't the kind of fight they had signed up for. They were just two ordinary people who had been unlucky enough to get tangled in Marino's web. But now, they had to play their part in a larger game, one that could cost them everything. Reed spread a series of photos and documents across the table. They were pictures of people Rachel had never seen before, but the names attached were all too familiar. Marino's right-hand man, his enforcers, business partners. These are the key players in Marino's operation. We've identified them, but we need to gather more intel, names, locations, secret meetings. Whatever you can find will help us piece this together. Rachel's stomach turned. This was no longer just about surviving. This was about betrayal, secrecy, and becoming part of something far bigger than they could have ever imagined. Okay, Jack said, breaking the silence. But how do we even get close to them? We don't exactly have the best reputation with his people. Reed nodded, his expression serious. That's where the plan comes in. We're going to use a cover. I know this isn't easy to hear, but you two are going to be the bait. You've already shown that you're tough enough to handle their attention. The next step is to leverage that to get close to Marino's people. Rachel felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Bait. The word echoed in her mind, and it sent a wave of dread over her. They were being asked to put themselves in direct danger, to become targets all over again. But this time, they were being asked to trust people they barely knew. What exactly are we supposed to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. Reed met her gaze. We're going to set up a sting operation. You'll attend a couple of Marino's social events, bars, clubs, things like that. He likes to keep a low profile but can't resist showing off. We'll have eyes on you, but you'll need to get close enough to some of his key people. Find out who's working with him, what they're planning, and report back. The idea of stepping into Marino's world, surrounded by criminals who had no problem taking lives, made Rachel's blood run cold. But she knew what they were asking wasn't just for show. This was real. They were putting their lives on the line for something bigger than themselves. How long do we have? Jack asked, his voice steady but tinged with doubt. Reed leaned back, rubbing his chin. We need intel fast. Marino's operations are fragile right now, and he knows we're closing in. Every day we wait, we risk him slipping away. We can't let him get away again. Rachel didn't say anything. Her thoughts were racing. She had never imagined this was how her life would turn out, living under the threat of death, working with law enforcement she didn't fully trust, becoming part of something that felt like it had no end. But she had no choice. The danger was real. And it was closing in fast. I don't like it, Jack muttered, standing up from the table, but I don't see any other way out. Reed gave him a small nod. I know it's hard, but we're running out of time. You two are our best shot at bringing Marino down. Rachel stood, taking a deep breath to steady herself. When do we start? Reed's eyes flickered with approval. Tonight. The dim lights of the underground club flickered as Rachel and Jack stepped inside, their eyes adjusting to the darkness. The music thumped in their chests, and the air was thick with the scent of sweat, alcohol, and the faintest trace of danger. The place was packed, loud, chaotic, and filled with people who seemed to be enjoying their anonymity. But Rachel knew better. Every face in the crowd was a potential threat. Every whisper, every glance, could be a sign of something far more sinister. This was Marino's world, and they were stepping into it willingly. Jack's grip on her hand tightened, as if he were trying to steady her, or perhaps himself. But Rachel could feel his nerves, too. They had come this far, but it still didn't feel like they were ready. They were walking a fine line between survival and destruction. "Stay close," Jack muttered, his voice low. "This is only going to get worse from here." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a feeling Jack was right. Things were going to get much worse before they had any hope of getting out of this. They walked deeper into the club, scanning the faces, trying to pick out anyone who looked even remotely familiar. The night stretched on, the hours slipping by as they navigated the shadows, searching for any clue, any sign that could help them take Marino down. But the deeper they went, the more Rachel realized how dangerous this game had become. There were no rules, no guarantees, only survival. And in this world, survival came at a steep price. As they made their way through the crowd, Rachel's eyes locked onto a man sitting at a back table, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the dim lighting. He didn't belong here, too calm, too composed. The way he watched the crowd told Rachel everything she needed to know. He was one of Marino's men. Her heart skipped a beat. This was it. They had found one of the key players. "Jack," she whispered, nudging him. "Over there." Jack followed her gaze and nodded. Without saying another word, they made their way toward the man. "Do you think Rachel and Jack are ready to take on Marino's people, or are they walking straight into danger? What would you do in their shoes? Let us know your thoughts below." The noise in the club seemed to swell, drowning out Rachel's thoughts as she and Jack made their way toward the table where the man with the sunglasses sat. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and every step felt heavier, like the weight of the decision they'd made was pressing down on her chest. There was no turning back now. This was their chance to get close to Marino's operation, but it could cost them everything. Jack's hand subtly tightened around hers as they approached. Rachel's stomach twisted in knots. She wasn't sure if it was from nerves or the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but her body felt like it was on edge, ready for anything. The man at the table didn't acknowledge them at first, his attention fixed on the drink in front of him. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding them. The music pounded, the flashing lights created a dizzying atmosphere, but this man seemed untouched by it all. He wasn't just anyone. He was one of Marino's people. Jack leaned in first, his voice casual but firm. "Hey, mind if we join you?" The man slowly looked up, his dark sunglasses hiding his eyes. Rachel felt a chill crawl up her spine. There was something about his gaze, even obscured, that made her uneasy. Without a word, the man motioned for them to sit. Jack slid into the chair across from him, and Rachel followed, sitting a little more stiffly. She tried to appear confident, but her mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. They had to make their move carefully. One wrong word, one wrong move, and everything could fall apart. "You two lost or just looking for a good time?" the man asked, his voice low and smooth, almost too smooth. Jack kept his tone light, even as his eyes scanned the room. "A little bit of both. Heard this place was the spot to find interesting people." The man's lips curled slightly into what could almost be called a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting people," he repeated, as if testing the words. "You're in luck. You've found one." Rachel forced herself to stay calm. This was their opening, the moment to get him talking, to draw him out. But it was also the moment where everything could go wrong. "We're looking for something," Rachel spoke up, trying to sound casual, even though her heart was pounding. "Something big. Something that pays well." The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He took a slow sip from his drink, his eyes never leaving her face. Then, he leaned back in his chair, the movement deliberate, almost as though he was weighing them. "Paying well, huh?" He chuckled softly, his voice dripping with amusement. "You don't seem like the usual kind of people I meet here. You sure you're looking in the right place?" Rachel felt the weight of his scrutiny, but she refused to look away. If she showed any weakness now, they were done. She had to keep her composure. "We know people," Jack said smoothly, his tone just the right mix of confidence and subtle threat. "And we know what we're doing. We're not exactly newcomers to this." The man tilted his head slightly, his interest piqued. He tapped his fingers against the table, seemingly considering their words. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "You're in a dangerous game," he said, his voice suddenly more serious. "If you're looking to get in, it's not going to be easy. Marino doesn't take kindly to outsiders, especially ones who think they can just waltz in and make deals. You'd better be ready for the consequences." Rachel swallowed hard but held her ground. "We've already dealt with danger. We're here to make things interesting." There was a flicker of something behind his dark sunglasses, maybe surprise, maybe amusement, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Fine," the man said finally, pushing his drink aside. "But if you're going to get involved, you need to prove yourselves. Marino likes his people to show loyalty, and that's not something he gives easily." Jack exchanged a look with Rachel. This was the moment. If they pushed too hard, they'd lose everything. But if they didn't act now, they might lose their only chance. "We're in," Jack said firmly. "Just tell us what we need to do." The man's lips curled into a thin, calculating smile. "All right then. You'll meet some of Marino's associates tomorrow night. But be warned, they don't take kindly to being tested. Don't expect a warm welcome." With that, the conversation came to an abrupt end. The man stood up, his tall figure looming over them. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Rachel felt the weight of his departure immediately. What had just happened? Had they made the right move, or had they just walked right into Marino's trap? Jack sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "That went better than I thought," he muttered. "But I still don't like it." Rachel exhaled, trying to process everything. "I don't know if I like it either. But we can't back out now. We have to stick to the plan." They lingered for a moment, their minds racing, before Jack stood up and motioned for Rachel to follow him. It was time to leave the club, time to regroup and figure out the next steps. The sting operation was underway, and they had just taken the first step into a dangerous world. As they exited the club and stepped into the cool night air, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The night had gone too smoothly. Marino's people didn't just let strangers into their fold that easily. Something was lurking, waiting to spring a trap. She just hoped they were ready for whatever came next. Do you think Rachel and Jack made the right call by trusting Marino's associate? What would you have done in their situation? Share your thoughts below. The streets outside the club were quieter than they expected. The city, with its neon lights and constant hum, seemed to shift as soon as they stepped away from the chaos inside. The air was crisp, but Rachel could still feel the heat of the night pressing against her skin. She walked beside Jack, her thoughts swirling with what had just transpired. Their encounter with Marino's associate felt like the beginning of something much darker and much more dangerous. Jack glanced over at her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. It was clear he could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself like she was about to explode. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure how to. Her mind was spinning with 1,000 questions. The man they'd just spoken to had been too calm, too calculating. Everything about their interaction felt staged, like they were being watched from the moment they walked in. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice low. "Something about him didn't sit right with me. I'm not sure we can trust him, or anyone connected to Marino." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, me neither. But right now, we don't have much choice. We've gone too far." Rachel let out a sharp breath, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. But it was hard. The weight of what they were getting into felt heavier with each step they took. They were walking into a world of violence and lies, where the stakes were higher than they'd ever imagined. They reached the car in silence. As Jack slid into the driver's seat, Rachel took a deep breath and tried to clear her mind. They needed to focus, to think strategically. Their next move was critical, and she couldn't afford to let fear cloud her judgment. The drive back to their apartment was uneventful, but Rachel couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest. She replayed every word, every gesture, from their encounter with Marino's associate. There was something off about the whole situation. Had they been set up? It was possible. Marino had eyes everywhere. He knew they were coming, and they had just made themselves targets. As Jack parked the car and cut the engine, Rachel turned to him. "We need to talk about what comes next. We can't just walk into whatever trap Marino's set for us." Jack nodded. I know. We'll be careful. But I'm not backing out now. We've already come this far. Rachel hesitated. She didn't want to admit it, but a part of her was afraid. She had always prided herself on being tough, on handling whatever life threw at her. But this wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about playing a game with people who had no qualms about destroying anyone who got in their way. I'm with you, she said quietly, her voice steady. But we need to be smart. We need to find out everything we can about Marino, about the people who work for him, before we make any more moves. Jack stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. Finally, he spoke. We'll make it work, he said, his voice firm. We always do. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Rachel and Jack knew the risks of what they were about to do, but they also knew that staying on the sidelines wasn't an option. They had no choice but to continue forward, to play Marino's game, and hope they were prepared for whatever came next. As evening approached, Rachel dressed in a way that would attract attention. Something dark, something seductive, something that would make her blend in with the crowd at the next event they were supposed to attend. It was a risky move, but it was the only move they had. They had to appear like they belonged, like they were part of Marino's world. Jack was quiet as he prepared, his expression focused. He looked the part, confident, dangerous, someone who had seen too much and didn't care. But Rachel knew him better than that. She could see the tension in his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his collar. He wasn't as calm as he appeared, and she wasn't either. They arrived at the venue just as night fell. The club was larger than the one they'd been to the night before, a sprawling, upscale place that screamed luxury and excess. It was clear that Marino's people frequented places like this, mixing business with pleasure in a way that made Rachel's skin crawl. The glitzy exterior couldn't hide the darkness lurking underneath. The music was louder here, the crowd even more raucous. There were more suits, more power, more danger. As they stepped inside, Rachel couldn't help but feel like they were walking into a lion's den, their lives dangling by a thread. She scanned the room for familiar faces, hoping for some sign that they weren't being watched. Jack leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. Stay close. We're looking for an opportunity. Rachel nodded, her senses on high alert. She had no idea what they were supposed to do once they found Marino's associates, but the one thing she knew for sure was that they couldn't afford to be reckless. They made their way through the crowd, Rachel's nerves on edge. Every person who glanced at them seemed like a potential threat. Were they being watched? She couldn't tell. The whole place seemed like a maze of shadows and hidden motives. As they passed the bar, Rachel's eyes landed on a familiar face. One of the men from the photos Reed had shown them. She had no doubt about it. This man was one of Marino's key players, and they had to get close. Jack, she whispered, her voice low. I think we found him. Jack's eyes followed her gaze, and he nodded slightly. Let's make our move. Do you think Rachel and Jack can pull this off, or are they in over their heads? What's your prediction for what will happen next? Share your thoughts with us below. The man at the bar was older than Rachel had expected, his salt and pepper hair slicked back with precision. He wore an expensive suit, the kind that didn't just scream wealth but bellowed it, tailored perfectly to his frame, even the tiniest detail well thought out. There was an air about him that screamed authority, like he was someone who didn't need to speak much because people already listened when he entered the room. Rachel's heart raced as she and Jack made their way toward the bar. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the adrenaline pushing her forward. They had to be careful. The man sitting there was important to Marino's operations, and a single mistake could turn the night into something much more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Jack's hand brushed against her back in a gesture that felt reassuring, but Rachel couldn't shake the tension. Every step closer to the man felt like stepping deeper into a trap. Just follow my lead, Jack whispered, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something more. A warning, a reminder of how high the stakes were. Rachel nodded, giving him a slight smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. They approached the bar, and Jack leaned in first, placing his elbow casually on the counter as though he belonged here. The man at the bar didn't turn to look at them immediately. He finished his drink and placed the glass down with deliberate slowness. Finally, he turned to face them, and Rachel felt her breath catch. His eyes were cold, calculating, like he was already sizing them up. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Didn't expect to see new faces tonight. What's your business here?" Rachel could feel the weight of his words, but she kept her posture relaxed, even as her pulse quickened. "Just looking for the right opportunity," she replied, matching his calm tone. "Heard a lot of good things about this place, and your connections." The man's lips twitched slightly, either in amusement or mild surprise. She couldn't tell. "Is that so?" His eyes shifted over to Jack, then back to Rachel. "Connections are expensive, and they come with strings attached." Jack laughed lightly, though it was a bit too sharp to be convincing. "We've got the right kind of currency," he said. "We know people, and we've got skills that could be useful." The man regarded them silently for a long moment, clearly weighing their words. The tension between them grew, and Rachel could feel her stomach tightening. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for the man to speak again. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said at last, his voice smooth, like his words were carefully measured. "But guts alone won't get you far around here. I'm not in the business of doing favors for anyone unless I know I'll get something in return." Rachel kept her expression neutral. This was the moment. She couldn't afford to hesitate. "We're not looking for favors," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We're looking for a partnership. We've got information and skills that could help with Marino's interests." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't look away. "Information, you say? What kind of information?" Rachel felt Jack shift slightly, but she didn't take her eyes off the man. They come this far. Now, they had to see how far the man would go. "Information that could be useful in the right hands," Rachel replied, a slight edge to her voice now. "We know what's going on in the streets. We know how Marino's operation works. And we know where to strike if the time comes." The man's gaze flickered for just a moment, and that was enough for Rachel to feel a small spark of victory. He was listening now, truly listening. He slowly leaned back, the expression on his face unreadable. "All right," he said finally. "You've got my attention. But I don't do business with just anyone, especially not people who walk in off the street and start talking about Marino's operation like it's theirs to control." He paused, his tone suddenly colder. "You're going to need to prove you're more than just talk." Jack and Rachel exchanged a glance, both of them tense. This was it, the moment they would either make their mark or be cut loose. "We're ready," Jack said, his voice low and firm. The man gave them a single nod, before turning away and signaling to a waiter standing nearby. "Meet me tomorrow at the warehouse," he said, not looking at them. "You'll have your chance to prove you're as good as you claim. If you make it out alive, we'll talk business." Without another word, he stood up, his back straight as he walked away, leaving Jack and Rachel standing there. Rachel couldn't help but watch him, her thoughts racing. Tomorrow. The door to their opportunity had just cracked open. But how much danger were they willing to walk into? Do you think Jack and Rachel can survive tomorrow's test? Or is the man setting them up for failure? What do you think their next move should be? Share your predictions and thoughts below. The warehouse loomed ahead as Rachel and Jack drove through the desolate industrial part of town. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over the surroundings. There was no sign of life, no sounds of traffic or pedestrians, just the hum of the car engine and the feeling of impending danger that weighed heavily on them. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming nervously against her knee. The anticipation was thick in the air, as if the entire night had been building up to this single moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a test. It was a trap, a way for Marino's people to measure their worth before they decided if they were a threat or an asset. Jack didn't say much during the drive. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, but Rachel could sense the tension in him as well. This wasn't the first time he had walked into danger, but there was something different about tonight. This time, it wasn't just about getting in and getting out. It was about surviving and proving they had what it took to play the game at Marino's level. The warehouse was old, its concrete walls cracked and weathered. The flickering lights inside cast long shadows, and the sound of their footsteps echoed as they made their way toward the entrance. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior with steel beams crisscrossing above them. The smell of oil and rust filled the air, and there was a palpable sense of abandonment, as though no one had set foot here in years. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on her. This wasn't just a warehouse. This was Marino's territory, and they were intruders. They couldn't afford to make a single misstep. "We're here," Jack said quietly, his eyes scanning the room. "Stay sharp." Before Rachel could respond, a man stepped out from the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate. It was the same man from the bar, the one who had given them the meeting time. His cold eyes studied them both as he approached. "You two made it," he said, his voice low and almost bored. "I wasn't sure if you'd show. You're a lot braver than most." Rachel's muscles tensed, but she kept her composure. "We're here to prove ourselves. You wanted proof, and we're ready to give it." The man eyed her for a moment before turning to Jack. "You both seem eager. That's good. But eagerness alone won't get you far in this business." He glanced around the warehouse, where a few men were standing, their arms crossed, watching intently. It was clear they were waiting for something to happen, and Rachel didn't have to guess what. "Tell me," the man continued, "how do you plan on proving you're valuable to Marino?" Jack stepped forward, his tone firm. "We've got information and skills that no one else has. We've seen things, heard things. We know how Marino's enemies operate, where they're weak, and where they're strongest. We know how to fight and how to win." He glanced at Rachel, who nodded in agreement. The man didn't look impressed. Instead, he motioned to one of his men. "Take them to the back. We'll see if you've got what it takes." The men moved quickly, and before they knew it, Rachel and Jack were being led down a narrow hallway at the back of the warehouse. The walls were lined with empty crates and dust-covered equipment, the silence almost suffocating. Rachel's breath hitched as they reached a large metal door, the only other source of light coming from a single bulb overhead. "Behind this door," the man said, "you'll find your test. Make it through, and we'll talk. Fail, and well, you won't get a second chance." Rachel exchanged a quick glance with Jack. There was no going back now. They had come too far. The doors swung open, and they were immediately hit with a burst of noise. Shouting, the clanging of metal, the sound of feet shuffling across the concrete floor. It was an underground fight club, something straight out of a nightmare. Men were fighting in cages, surrounded by jeering spectators who cheered on their favorite gladiators. The atmosphere was thick with sweat and aggression, and it felt like the walls were closing in on Rachel with every breath. "This is your test," the man said, his voice barely audible over the din. "Prove you can survive in here, and we'll consider taking you on." Rachel's stomach churned as she realized what he meant. This wasn't about talking or bargaining. It was about survival, about proving they could fight their way through whatever hell Marino had set up for them. Jack's face was grim, but there was a determination in his eyes. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. They were led to the center of the room, where two men stood waiting for them. The crowd quieted, sensing the tension in the air. The two fighters were muscular and intimidating, their faces set in expressions of cold, hard determination. "Your turn," the man said, his voice dripping with amusement. Rachel's heart raced, but she steadied herself. She had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. She had no choice but to fight. She couldn't back down, not now. The bell rang, and the fight began. How do you think Rachel and Jack will fare in this brutal test? Will they manage to survive, or will they be overwhelmed by the violence they're walking into? Let us know your thoughts and predictions. The air inside the warehouse seemed to thicken with each passing second, the noise from the surrounding spectators growing louder, more intense. Rachel's muscles tensed as she sized up her opponents. The two men in front of her were no amateurs. They were built like tanks, each one with scars and bruises that told the story of countless battles fought and won. Rachel could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her mind racing as her body instinctively slipped into the familiar rhythm of preparation. She had fought before, but never in a setting like this. Never under the watchful eyes of the most dangerous people in the room. Jack stood beside her, his eyes locked on their opponents as he cracked his knuckles, his expression focused but alert. She could tell he wasn't afraid. He had been through worse, but she could see the faint glint of uncertainty in his eyes. They both knew that the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The bell rang again, the signal to start the fight, and the room erupted into a roar. The two men advanced immediately, one coming toward Rachel with surprising speed, while the other circled Jack. Rachel didn't hesitate. She ducked to the side as the first man lunged at her, his fists aimed at her head. She was faster than he anticipated, sidestepping and delivering a sharp kick to his ribs. He grunted and staggered back, but it only fueled his rage. He came at her again, this time with a brutal swing aimed at her midsection. Rachel blocked the punch with her forearm, gritting her teeth as the impact vibrated through her body. She didn't waste time thinking. She threw a quick jab to his jaw, following it up with an elbow to the side of his head. The blow landed with a satisfying crunch, and he stumbled, momentarily dazed. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Jack exchange a series of heavy blows with his opponent. Jack was a force of nature, his strikes precise and powerful, but his opponent was relentless. The man was bigger, his sheer size a problem. Still, Jack was holding his own, refusing to give an inch. But Rachel didn't have time to focus on Jack's fight. Her opponent, now visibly angry, regained his footing and came back at her with fury. This time, he aimed for her legs, trying to trip her up. Rachel's instincts kicked in, and she sidestepped again, using his momentum to grab his arm and twist it behind his back. She pushed him toward the ground with all her strength, hearing the satisfying crack of his bones as he hit the cold concrete floor. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, and Rachel took a step back, watching her opponent struggle to get back up. He was still dangerous, though. He wasn't down for good. Jack had his own problem. His opponent had him cornered, delivering a barrage of punches. Rachel saw the moment Jack faltered, just enough to make the other man think he had the upper hand. But Jack wasn't done yet. In one swift motion, he dodged a punch and, using his momentum, slammed his knee into the man's stomach. The crowd roared in approval as the man crumpled, gasping for breath. Rachel's focus snapped back to her opponent. He had recovered and was coming at her once again. But this time, he wasn't alone. The other fighter, the one Jack had been up against, was back on his feet too. They were both moving toward her. Rachel's heart pounded. She could feel the weight of the situation closing in. There was no way they were getting out of here without a fight, without showing these men what they were capable of. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about making it clear that they weren't to be underestimated. She exchanged a quick glance with Jack, and he nodded. Together, they would do this. Rachel launched herself at the first man, aiming low to take him down. She used her momentum to spin him around, throwing him off balance. The second fighter tried to grab her from behind, but Jack was there, throwing a right hook that landed square on his jaw. The man stumbled backward, allowing Jack to deliver a crushing knee to his ribs. The two men were reeling, but they weren't done yet. They came at Rachel and Jack once more, but this time, the fight had shifted. Rachel and Jack were in sync, moving as one, anticipating each other's moves. Every strike, every dodge, was perfectly timed. With a final, coordinated effort, Rachel swept the legs of the first man, sending him crashing to the ground. At the same time, Jack landed a brutal punch to the second man's face, knocking him to the floor. The crowd's cheering grew louder, but Rachel couldn't focus on anything but the victory in front of her. Both men were down, and the room fell into a stunned silence. The man who had led them into the fight, he wasn't impressed, but he was interested. He nodded slowly, then clapped his hands together once, signaling the end of the fight. Well, he said, his voice cold, but there was a hint of approval in his tone. You've got fight in you. I'll give you that. But let's see how you handle the next challenge. You've made it past the first test, but there's much more to prove if you want to work for Marino. Rachel wiped the sweat from her brow and took a deep breath, her muscles sore and bruised, but her resolve was stronger than ever. They had passed the first test, but the real challenge was just beginning. Rachel and Jack have made it through the first round, but what do you think their next challenge will be? Do you think they can continue to prove themselves, or will they face even tougher obstacles? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comments. Rachel's heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her muscles aching from the brutal fight. It had been close, too close at times, but they had made it through. But as the cheers from the crowd died down, Rachel couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. This was far from over. The man who had been observing their fight, a middle-aged figure with sharp eyes and an air of authority, motioned for them to follow him. The others who had been watching the fight dispersed, and the air in the room grew quieter, as if a new tension had settled over the warehouse. Rachel didn't trust any of it. She had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something much darker. The man led them down a narrow hallway at the back of the warehouse, the cold concrete floor echoing beneath their feet. Rachel's senses were heightened. Every sound felt amplified in the silence of the corridor. Jack was walking just a step ahead of her, his posture still rigid with caution, his eyes darting around, always alert. "This way," the man said, his voice curt and to the point. They reached a large steel door at the end of the hall. The man didn't knock, just turned the handle and stepped inside, motioning for Rachel and Jack to follow. Inside the room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the fight. It was sterile quiet, with a single overhead light casting a harsh glow over a long table in the center. There were several figures sitting at the table, 3 men and 1 woman. The woman was the first to stand as they entered, her gaze locking onto Rachel with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She was dressed sharply, a black leather jacket over a white blouse, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. "Rachel," she said, her voice smooth, almost calculated. "Jack, I've been expecting you." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You've been expecting us? From the moment we walked in?" The woman's lips curved into a slight smile. "No, not from the moment you walked in, but we've been keeping tabs on you. You've made quite a name for yourself, especially in the last few months. That fight just now? Impressive." Jack's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. The woman's words only confirmed his suspicion that they were being watched much more closely than they had thought. "So, what's next?" Rachel asked, not wanting to waste time with pleasantries. The woman's expression shifted from amusement to something more serious. "Next, you prove your loyalty. It's one thing to survive a fight in the ring, but Marino needs people who can think, who can strategize. He needs people who can make decisions under pressure, who won't break when things get messy." Rachel and Jack exchanged a glance, both sensing the underlying threat in the woman's words. This wasn't just a job interview. This was a test of character, a test of loyalty, and they were about to be thrown into the deep end. "Are we supposed to be impressed by all this?" Jack asked, his voice cold. The woman didn't flinch. "You should be. Marino's people don't waste time on those who can't handle what comes next. This isn't a game." Rachel couldn't help but feel a little angry. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. But she was determined to show them she wasn't some pawn to be played. "What exactly do you need from us?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman walked around the table, her heels clicking against the floor with each step. She paused, studying them for a moment, before speaking again. "There's a problem in the city. Marino's enemies are making moves, and it's getting harder to keep them in check. We need people who can get in, gather intel, and find a way to neutralize the threat before it escalates." Rachel frowned, a knot forming in her stomach. This wasn't the kind of job she had in mind when she first set out, but she wasn't here to back down. She was here to fight for something more than just survival. "And what makes you think we're the right fit?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension. The woman smiled again, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Because, Rachel, you've already proven you can fight. But we need more than that. We need loyalty, we need intelligence, and we need people who can get the job done without asking too many questions." There was a pause in the room as Rachel and Jack exchanged looks again, this time in silent agreement. The stakes were rising, but so was their resolve. If they were going to make it out of this unscathed, they needed to play the game by their rules, and if that meant trusting people like these, then they had no choice but to move forward. "What do you want us to do?" Jack asked, his voice hard. The woman's smile faded, and she gestured toward the door. "Follow me." As they left the sterile room, the tension in the air grew heavier. Rachel could sense that they were being drawn deeper into a world that didn't play by the rules they were used to. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about navigating a web of deception, loyalty, and betrayal. They followed the woman down another dark corridor, the silence between them punctuated only by the sound of their footsteps. It felt like they were walking into the lion's den, but they couldn't turn back now. Too much was on the line. The woman stopped at a small, locked room at the end of the hall. She unlocked it and pushed the door open, revealing a table full of maps, documents, and surveillance photos. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "Here's what we know," the woman said, her voice low and serious. "This is where the next battle begins. What do you think Rachel and Jack will find in this room? How will they handle the dangerous new task that's being set before them? Let us know what you think in the comments." The room smelled of old paper and ink. Maps, blueprints, and photographs covered the large wooden table, each one meticulously arranged and marked with red circles, crosses, and lines. Rachel's eyes skimmed over the details, but she was already starting to understand. This was no ordinary job. The stakes were higher than she had anticipated. The woman, the one who had led them here, walked around the table, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "We've been monitoring the movement of several rival organizations," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Marino's enemies are closing in. They're trying to take control of parts of the city, territory that Marino is not willing to lose." Rachel leaned in closer to study the map. "Who are they? Who are we up against?" The woman's fingers tapped against a photo pinned on the wall. It was a picture of a man in his 40s, wearing a dark suit, his expression intense. "This is Victor Mendez. He's been expanding his operation in the area. He's ruthless, strategic, and well-connected. He has a team of mercenaries working for him, and they've been causing trouble for Marino's people. We can't let this go on much longer." Jack crossed his arms, staring at the image. "So, you want us to take him down?" The woman didn't flinch. "Not exactly. We need information first. The key to defeating Mendez isn't brute force. It's knowing where he's vulnerable. We need to infiltrate his inner circle, find out where he's hiding his assets, and gather intel. Once we have that, we can make our move." Rachel and Jack exchanged a look. This wasn't going to be easy, but it wasn't impossible either. Rachel had spent years building up her skills, using every trick in the book to stay one step ahead of people who were just as dangerous as Mendez. But this was different. They weren't just fighting in the streets. They were diving into a web of deception, secrecy, and power. "Do you have a plan?" Jack asked, his voice firm. The woman nodded, her eyes locking onto his. "We have a few leads. We've been tracking one of Mendez's men, a guy named Leo. He's been running errands for Mendez, making deliveries, and moving money around. We think he knows more than he's letting on. We need to get close to him. If we can turn him, get him to trust you, you might be able to extract information directly from him." Rachel's stomach churned. This was where it got dangerous. Mendez was no fool. If they were going to get close to Leo, they would need to blend in, play their part, and become part of Mendez's world. "How do you suggest we make contact with him?" Rachel asked. The woman pulled out a small envelope from her jacket pocket and slid it across the table. "Inside is a location. Leo's going to be at a nightclub tonight. It's one of Mendez's fronts. You'll find him there, but you'll need to be careful. There are eyes everywhere, and Mendez doesn't tolerate mistakes." Rachel felt the weight of the envelope in her hand. Her instincts were screaming that this was a trap, but there was no turning back now. They had to do this if they were going to survive. "We'll be careful," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "We'll get close to Leo. We'll find out what he knows." The woman studied them for a moment, as if weighing their words. Finally, she nodded. "Good. You'll leave in the next hour. Get to the nightclub, get the intel, and get out. The sooner you're done, the better." With that, she turned on her heel and left the room, leaving Rachel and Jack to process everything. The plan was clear, but the risks were immense. If they made even one wrong move, they could end up dead, or worse. Jack stood there for a moment, his arms still crossed. He didn't look at Rachel, but seemed to be thinking deeply. "You know, this isn't what I expected when we got into this. It's getting heavier." Rachel didn't reply immediately. She knew what he meant. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about playing a dangerous game with the most powerful criminals in the city. But Rachel wasn't the type to back down. She was in it for the long haul now. "We can handle it," she said finally, her voice firm. "We've come this far. We just need to stay sharp and stay focused." Jack nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't trust Mendez's people, and he certainly didn't trust the woman who had just sent them on this mission. But Rachel knew they had no choice but to follow through. They couldn't afford to look back. The two of them left the room, making their way out of the warehouse and back into the dark streets of the city. The tension in the air was palpable as they approached their car. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to calm the nervous energy that was building inside her. Tonight, they were going to walk into the lion's den, and they couldn't afford to show fear. The nightclub wasn't far. The address on the envelope led them to an upscale part of town, where the neon lights glowed brightly against the night sky. As they parked across the street from the venue, Rachel couldn't help but feel the weight of what was ahead. This wasn't going to be a simple meet and greet. There were too many unknowns, too many risks. "I'll go in first," Jack said, breaking the silence. "I'll approach Leo, see if I can get a feel for the situation." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I'll cover you from a distance. If anything goes wrong—" "I know," Jack interrupted. "We're in this together." Rachel watched him walk toward the entrance, his figure swallowed by the flashing lights and noise from the club. She took another deep breath and followed, steeling herself for whatever came next. They were about to step into a world that neither of them fully understood. But if they were going to survive, they had to play the game. And they had to win. What do you think will happen when Rachel and Jack meet Leo at the nightclub? Will they be able to get the intel they need? Or is there more danger lurking than they realize? Share your predictions with us in the comments. The nightclub was alive with sound, its bass-heavy music vibrating through the thick walls. A crowd of well-dressed individuals filled the space, some chatting in groups while others moved on the dance floor, lost in the rhythm. The neon lights flashed sporadically, painting the room in a kaleidoscope of color. Everything about the place screamed danger, a blend of wealth, power, and secrets. Rachel felt a chill slide down her spine as she stepped through the door, her eyes scanning the crowd. Jack had already slipped inside, blending into the shadows, his movements fluid and confident. Rachel watched him as he moved toward the bar, his eyes searching the room. It didn't take long before he spotted Leo, sitting in a corner booth, talking with a man who looked like trouble. Leo, a short, stocky man with a buzz cut and an all-business demeanor, was exactly what Rachel had expected. Sharp, calculating, with a slight air of arrogance. Rachel adjusted her jacket and made her way deeper into the club, careful to keep her distance. Her fingers brushed the concealed weapon at her side, just a reminder that things could get ugly fast. She wasn't here to start a fight, but she wasn't afraid to finish one if it came to that. The bar was crowded, and Rachel made sure to keep her attention on Leo. Jack was making his move, taking a seat on the opposite side of the booth, appearing casual, but with every muscle in his body coiled in anticipation. Rachel could see him talking to Leo's companion, a man in his early 30s who looked like he'd seen more than his share of shady deals. Rachel didn't have time to wait. The situation was escalating too quickly, and she needed to be closer. She slid through the crowd, past a group of laughing men in suits, until she was standing a few feet from Leo's booth. Her eyes flicked back and forth between Jack and the men, trying to catch a moment when she could slip in unnoticed. Leo glanced up for a moment, his eyes narrowing when he saw her standing nearby. She had never met him before, but she knew the look in his eyes. Calculation, suspicion, and perhaps a little bit of interest. Rachel wasn't sure whether to approach or to let Jack take the lead, but before she could decide, Jack gestured for her to come closer. Taking a deep breath, she moved forward. The noise in the club seemed to fade into the background as she closed the distance between them. Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his hand subtly rested near the small of his back, signaling that he was ready for anything. "Leo, right?" Rachel's voice was smooth, calm, the way she had been taught to speak when dealing with dangerous people. Leo glanced at her but didn't immediately respond. His companion, the one with the tattoos running up his neck, shot her a wary look before turning his attention back to Jack. Leo finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "And who are you?" Rachel smiled, leaning against the booth. A friend of a friend. I heard you might be able to help with a little business deal. The tension in the air thickened. The man beside Leo shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes flicking between her and Jack. Leo remained still, assessing her with a steady gaze. Business? You came all the way here for a business deal? Rachel didn't break eye contact. That's right. I know you have your hands in a lot of different things. Maybe I can help you with one of them. In return, you help me with something. Leo's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in it. I don't do favors for strangers, sweetheart. You've got to be more specific than that. Rachel didn't flinch. I know about the shipments you've been moving through the city, big ones. I also know who you've been working with. I'm willing to overlook a lot of things, but I need something in return. Jack's hand shifted slightly, preparing for whatever might come next. The tension was almost unbearable, but Rachel remained calm, her voice unwavering. Information, Leo. We know you're working for Mendez. You know something that could bring him down. All we need is that information. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Leo's eyes remained fixed on Rachel, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, a mix of annoyance and intrigue. His companion, sensing the tension, stood up and reached into his jacket, but Leo held up a hand to stop him. Information, huh? Leo's voice was a low growl now. You think I'm just going to hand that over to you? Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. This was the moment of truth. If they didn't play this right, it could all go south. She had to convince Leo that she was someone worth talking to, someone who had power, someone who couldn't be ignored. I'm not asking for charity, she said coolly. I'm offering something you can't get anywhere else. You want to keep your operation running smoothly, don't you? You want to be ahead of Mendez's people? You'll need me. Jack shifted in his seat, watching the exchange carefully. The room felt smaller, the noise of the club fading into a distant hum as the three of them locked eyes. Leo leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the table. He seemed to be considering something, weighing his options. Then, finally, Leo spoke, his voice quiet but filled with a quiet threat. You don't know who you're dealing with, sweetheart. I don't give information freely. If you want something from me, you'll need to earn it. Rachel's pulse quickened. She had expected resistance, but not this level of arrogance. She knew she had to make a choice, either push harder or back off and regroup. The moment of hesitation passed quickly. Then we'll see what you have to offer, Rachel said, her voice sharp. But make no mistake, Leo, we're not leaving here without what we came for. Jack slowly stood up, his movements deliberate. Leo's companion tensed, his hand still hovering near the inside of his jacket. The air between them was electric, charged with the sense that something big was about to happen. The moment stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Rachel didn't flinch. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when they were so close to getting the information they needed. Leo leaned forward, his gaze hardening. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're about to find out just how dangerous it is to make enemies with people like me. What do you think Leo is going to do next? Will Rachel and Jack be able to get the information they need from him? Or is there an even bigger threat waiting for them? Share your thoughts and predictions in the comments. The tension was palpable. Every breath Rachel took felt like a countdown to something she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for. She could feel Jack's presence beside her, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. The nightclub, with its blaring music and flashing lights, suddenly felt far too small. The whole world seemed to narrow into a single moment, a dangerous one, where every choice could lead to disaster. Leo's eyes were hard, his lips barely moving as he spoke. You think you can come in here and make demands of me? I don't think you understand the position you're in. Rachel didn't back down. Her eyes locked onto his, calculating every movement, every flicker of emotion. She wasn't here to play games. She was here to get what she needed, and she wasn't leaving without it. I understand perfectly, she replied, her voice icy. But you don't understand what I'm willing to do to get what I need. You've made your choice, Leo. Now, you're going to tell me what I want to know, or I'll make sure you regret it. A tense silence settled between them. Leo's companion, still standing, hand inches from his gun, watched them both closely. The atmosphere in the booth was thick, oppressive, as if the club itself was holding its breath. Leo leaned back, studying Rachel and Jack. He could see that they weren't intimidated, that they weren't going to back down. He crossed his arms, his gaze flickering to the exit and back to the booth, calculating his next move. "You think you can scare me?" he asked, his voice low. "You're in my world now. I control the flow of information around here. You can't just waltz in and expect me to hand you something valuable." Rachel's pulse quickened. She knew this was the pivotal moment. They could keep pushing, but there were too many ways this could go wrong. If Leo called for backup, or worse, if he decided to make them a warning example, there would be no way out. She glanced at Jack, who met her eyes and gave the slightest nod. They had trained for moments like this. They'd learned to read each other without words, to know when to escalate, when to hold back, and when to strike. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering to a whisper. "Let me make something clear, Leo. If you think your position is safe, you're wrong. Mendez's enemies are closing in. If we leave here without that intel, you're going to be left standing in the ruins of your empire while we walk away unscathed. This isn't a threat. It's a promise." For a moment, Leo's expression faltered. It was almost imperceptible, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected this kind of pushback, but his arrogance quickly returned, and he leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Do you really think you're in control here?" he growled. "I could have you both killed before you even get out of this club." Rachel stayed calm, every muscle in her body ready to react. She didn't show fear. If Leo wanted a power struggle, she'd give him one. "You can try," she said, her voice calm but laced with an edge. "But I don't think that's in your best interest, Leo." The companion, who had been hovering near the exit, took a step forward. "Enough," Leo said suddenly, his voice rising with authority. "You want information? Fine, but you're going to have to earn it." Rachel didn't flinch, but her mind was racing. Earning it? She had no idea what Leo meant by that, but she didn't have time to question it. She needed to move. "We don't have time for games," she snapped. "You give us the intel, or this ends right now." Leo studied her for a moment, the corner of his lips curling up into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then, without warning, he stood up, signaling his companion to step back. "You're right," he said, his voice suddenly more measured. "I do have something for you. But first, you'll need to prove your loyalty. You want to take down Mendez? Then you'll need to show me you can play in the big leagues." Rachel's stomach churned. She didn't like the sound of this. "What do you mean by that?" Leo's eyes gleamed with something dark. "There's a shipment coming in tomorrow. Mendez's men are moving something big. I can tell you exactly where it's going. But you're going to have to do a job for me first. Help me sabotage it, and I'll give you all the information you need." Rachel was taken aback. Sabotage? This wasn't part of the plan. But Leo was right about one thing. Mendez's men were a serious threat, and getting the intel was more important than sticking to the original script. They needed this. She glanced at Jack, who gave her a small nod. The decision was theirs. "We're in," Rachel said, her voice firm. Leo's grin widened. "Good. You'll find out the details tomorrow. If you succeed, you'll get what you came for. But if you fail—" He let the threat hang in the air, unsaid but clear. Rachel didn't respond. She wasn't here to make threats. She was here to finish what they started. Leo motioned for them to follow him, and the three of them exited the booth, weaving through the crowded club and toward a more private part of the building. As they passed through a set of double doors, Leo turned to them and gave one last warning. "You mess this up, and you won't make it out alive. You're on my turf now. You'll do this my way, or not at all." Rachel and Jack exchanged another look. They had walked into the lion's den, and now they were bound by the same rules as the predators. They had no choice but to play along, even if it meant taking on something darker than they had ever imagined. What do you think of Leo's ultimatum? Will Rachel and Jack be able to sabotage the shipment and get the intel they need? Or will they end up in even deeper trouble? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The night had barely begun to settle when Rachel and Jack made their way back through the city streets. The neon glow of the club was now a distant memory, but the weight of what they'd just agreed to was heavy in the air between them. The plan was simple, too simple. Really? They would sabotage the shipment, make their way through the chaos, and, if everything went according to plan, gather the intel they needed to bring Mendez down. But nothing was ever as easy as it seemed. As they walked side by side through the cold, the streets flickered with the reflections of the city lights. Jack's expression was grim, his brow furrowed in thought. He had been quiet ever since they left Leo's hideout. "You sure about this?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Jack shot her a side glance. "You think we have a choice?" Rachel exhaled sharply. "I just don't like the fact that Leo's pulling the strings now. We're not in control anymore." "I don't like it either," Jack admitted. "But we don't have time to waste. We get in, get what we need, and get out. After that, Leo's irrelevant." The wind whipped through the alleyways, and Rachel's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She could feel the tension building, her body on high alert. She had always been good at controlling her emotions in high-pressure situations, but this felt different. This felt personal. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" she asked, her voice soft, almost to herself. Jack glanced at her again, his eyes sharp in the dim light. "You don't make it this far in this world without being careful. He's hiding something, but we don't have the luxury of finding out everything right now." Rachel nodded, lost in her own thoughts. Jack was right. They were in this together, and no matter how much they questioned Leo's motives, there was no turning back now. Not until they had what they needed. They reached the edge of the city's industrial district, the cold metal of warehouses looming overhead. The truck depot where the shipment was supposed to arrive was just ahead. They had a plan, a backup plan, and a plan for the backup, but the air still felt thick with uncertainty. As they approached the warehouse, Rachel's mind raced with possibilities. She could feel the weight of the gun at her side, its cold metal a reminder that things could escalate quickly. They had to move fast, strike hard, and make sure they weren't left holding the bag when everything went south. They crouched down behind a stack of crates, watching the movement around the depot. Jack scanned the area, his eyes sharp. A few guards were stationed by the loading dock, and from what Rachel could see, it looked like the shipment was already being unloaded. "Time to move," Jack whispered, standing up slowly. "We're going in." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They had trained for moments like this, but this was different. This wasn't just a mission. This was their lives on the line. The two of them slipped through the shadows, moving closer to the docks. Rachel's breath was steady, her mind calculating the next step as they approached the entrance. One of the guards turned, his flashlight sweeping across the area. Jack held his breath, motioning for Rachel to stay still. The guard passed without noticing them, and they were in. The loading bay was chaotic. Trucks lined up, boxes and crates scattered across the ground. In the far corner, a large container was being unloaded, just as Leo had described. The heavy equipment and armed men around it were signs of how valuable whatever was inside truly was. Rachel exchanged a look with Jack. This was it. They had one shot to do this, and they had to be quick. The intel Leo promised them, everything they needed to bring Mendez down, was locked up in one of those crates. But getting to it wouldn't be easy. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, sharp and demanding. "Who's there?" Rachel's heart skipped a beat. They had been spotted. Jack reacted instantly, grabbing Rachel by the arm and pulling her into the shadows. A group of men started to move toward them, guns drawn. "Get ready," Jack whispered, his grip tightening. The first guard came into view, and Jack moved swiftly, taking him down in a silent, fluid motion. Rachel followed suit, her movements smooth and practiced. They were working like a well-oiled machine, each step calculated to avoid detection, each action designed to ensure their survival. The other guards were still unaware of the true threat until it was too late. A quick takedown, a flash of motion, and they were all incapacitated. The container was within reach. Rachel reached for her gun, but before she could make a move, Jack stopped her. He had already moved to the container's control panel, typing in a code. The door to the container creaked open, revealing what they had been searching for. Inside were documents, files, and a series of encrypted hard drives, the kind of information that could bring Mendez and his entire operation to its knees. Rachel grabbed one of the hard drives, her hands shaking slightly as she secured it in her bag. "Let's get out of here," Jack said urgently. But before they could leave, they heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. Their time was up. Rachel looked at Jack, determination in her eyes. "We won't make it out if we don't move now." They ran, their feet pounding against the cold concrete as they sprinted toward the exit. The sound of pursuit followed them, the growl of engines growing louder. A black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, the door opening just in time. Without a second thought, Rachel jumped inside, Jack right behind her. The vehicle sped off, the city lights flashing by as they disappeared into the night. Rachel leaned back, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. They had the intel. The first step was complete, but there was no time to relax. The real battle was just beginning. Do you think Rachel and Jack can pull off their next move without getting caught? Or will Mendez's people catch up to them first? What do you think their next step should be? Let us know in the comments.